So I'm happy to have all of you for our symposium of 2020. And
2020,
but now we have
yeah.
representation and reality, human, other living beings and intelligent machines. It's another, the continuation of other very interesting events on this very wide topic that crosses several disciplines, not only artificial intelligence, but also cognitive sciences, philosophies, and so on. So, hi Lorenzo.
Hi Gordana, Raffaela.
Very happy to have you.
How are you? Are you okay?
We are okay. At the moment, all seems okay. We only have to understand how to go ahead with this vaccine situation and so on.
Basti was in the plenary session. He will arrive soon, I think. Yeah.
Do you think, Gianfranco is with us? No, I think 1 minute more because it's a little bit difficult to understand soon how to move.
Okay.
I thought that it was immediate, no? The link, you click and then there is this other way to enter the rooms. So
Basti
okay.
arrived.
Yes. So just not to be too much late, I give the word to Gordana for his very interesting paper. And yes, I think at the end there will be questions and answers, Q&A. 5-10 minutes depends on Gordana. Okay. So hi everyone. I give the word to Gordana if she is ready.
Sure. Thank you, Raffaela. And can you just give me a sign when you believe I should stop?
Okay.
Or
okay.
what time? Maybe you have some. Plan.
But now it's 14 and to me, I think 40 minutes, Gordana. Then okay. You have 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
If you prefer 45.
I can speed up. I'm very much interested in discussion, so I can speed
depends
up.
on you. 40 minutes would be fine.
Okay. Thank you very much, Raffaela.
Okay, I mute myself.
Okay, let's start. It's really a pleasure, and I'm happy to be here, even on distance, to meet you again and to discuss what is happening right now in our field. And the title of my talk is Morphological Computation and Learning to Learn in Natural Intelligence Systems and AI. And it is building on work that I have been doing for many years. So let's say, I can tell you that, okay. You will find my presentation on my webpage. It is already there. So in case you want to see the details, they are, the file is on my page that you can find very easily on the web, just my name, gordana.se, like Sweden. Okay, so what we are talking a lot about connected to AI is deep learning. And at present, machine learning and especially deep learning is making enormous success. And the algorithms of deep learning have been inspired by nature, specifically by human brain. In spite of our incomplete knowledge about the brain function, but whatever we know about the brain, we are trying to implement in computational terms. However, deep learning intelligence is lacking several things. that Joshua Bengio, who is one of the three founding fathers of deep learning, has already noticed. There are still things that deep learning is lacking, and that is distribution generalization. So it is very dependent on the set where you train your system, compositionality, and common sense reasoning. And he proposed that in order to improve those features for deep learning, we should use the notion of agency, causality, attention, and consciousness as mechanisms for deep learning to improve. And he started proposing to look at Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 ideas. Are you familiar with Kahneman's ideas about systems? So he says that the System 1 that we have, he calls it thinking, but it is the way how we react to information that we get from the outside and that we that we compute in our brains. System 1 is fast, unconscious, automatic way of reacting, and System 2 is slow, conscious reasoning, planning, and so on. So in order to go from System 1 to System 2, we should try to understand how is it done in nature again. So deep learning is based on natural learning or natural neural networks. That was the inspiration. And now we are searching for inspiration in nature to get this connection between System 1 and System 2. Right now, we are in System 1, not completely System 1, but it resembles System 1. And so from System 1 to System 2 in deep learning, one can move with help of self-supervised learning. And there are two possibilities: either to be on the level of the space where we have a problem, space of image, text, or audio, or this can be moved a level above, which is this System 2, which is language level, symbolic level. So we will see on the bottom of the page, you see the references to Bengio, LeCun, and Hinton about deep learning, and Bengio on System 1 to System 2. So that's the inspiration. And so my idea is to learn from nature, to connect learning from nature and testing models on practical solutions, from technology to science and back. So computing connected to cognitive science and other sciences which can give us background for computational models. And many of you have done already a lot of work in this connecting of models of computation with physical or other processes in nature. And I mentioned here Gregor Rosenberg and Lila Kari, who has written a popular text on the many facets of natural computing, claiming that we learn all the time from both sides, both from nature, what we observe and experiment and so, and from technology that we construct inspired by natural sciences. And so the question is what we can find as inspiration in nature at this stage of the development of artificial intelligence. So this will be a very broad view, which is more meaning a mapping of the territory. So I identified some questions and some interesting topics that I believe could contribute to our better understanding of this territory. So, and this is in the sense of the following quotations. So one is by Ilya Prigozhin, who said, I invite readers not on a visit to an archaeological museum, but rather on an adventure in science in making. So it's really science in making. That's nothing finished or closed. And the other one is biology and computer science. Life and computation are related. I am confident that their interface, great discoveries await those who seek them. And that's Adelman who says, who has discovered these connections. And in Kari and Rosenberg that I mentioned already, they say, in these times brimming with excitement, our task is nothing less than to discover a new, broader notion of computation and to understand the world around us in terms of information processing. So that's the inspiration, that's the way of thinking. So how could we move, and people are already moving, beyond conventional computing through the research in natural computing, physical computing, morphological computing, and conventional computing. There is a lot of overlap between those fields. The progress of computing depends on the development of hardware and software, and this includes algorithms, programming languages, compilers, interpreters, operating systems, virtual machines, and so on. And yet computability theory is still based on the Turing machine model of computation. So Turing was so successful with his model of computation that it is, even today, in the time of parallel computing, natural computing, everything, the first thought when you think about computing, it's Turing model of computation. So that's also an idea to go beyond and see where can we use Turing and where can we go beyond, or where we must go beyond. So the goal is a computer able to simulate behavior of human mathematician, capable of intelligent insight. So not only mechanical execution of an algorithm like calculation, but also intelligent behavior and intelligent insight. And that's what people are developing in, among others, cognitive computing. So here is just one very important and significant book, Beyond Conventional Computing, Natural Computing, by the group of authors, which really give the handbook overview of all different sorts of natural computing. And how do we connect this with learning? Learning is a process which is central for acquiring, maintaining, and managing knowledge, both theoretical and practical. So we explore the relationships between the present advances in understanding of learning in the sciences, of artificial, like deep learning, robotics, in natural sciences, like neuroscience, cognitive science, biology, and philosophy of computing, philosophy of mind, and natural philosophy. So those are inspirations to try to get one interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary view of the problem. And again, our question is, what can we use of what is already known about learning in terms of natural sciences and also all those fields that I already mentioned. So I mentioned Bengio, who got the Turing Award 2018 together with Hinton and LeCun, and he proposed, as I told you, to go from system 1, which is the present day subsymbolic data processing approach, to the system 2, which is symbolic language, and so on. And one contribution in this development, when we move to the next level of abstraction to the system 2, is ability to learning to learn, which is impossible on the level 1. So we need this symbolic layer of computation or information processing that will link the lower level, which is connectionism, with symbolism or symbolic information processing. So we go to, this is an important point, that in the history of computing, the idea was to get the computers which are substrate independent. So they are not specific, they are general. And we were thinking about knowledge as something completely abstract and disembodied. And the same thing for cognition. So we were thinking about all those processes in abstracto. And now we are studying biological systems and generalizing ability to know, not only looking at knowledge in humans, but also in all of nature, in animals and even in plants. So Karl Popper, for example, already at that time, he made this insight that even plants possess a degree of cognition and intelligence. They solve the problems, they communicate, they process information and so on. And also when we look at the animals, we see that very simple animals like bees, honeybees, they have quite sophisticated ways of learning and communicating information and so on. So it's interesting for us to see how does the body of an organism influences the ability to generate knowledge, use knowledge, and generate behavior. So that's an interesting problem which is still open, and very new books like 21 just this year, Jablonka published about evolution of sensitive soul. She calls it sensitive soul, using expression by Aristotle. Saying that the very basic cognitive abilities, or the very basic soul, in the sense of Aristotle, exist already in very simple organisms like mollusks that already have a nervous system. So the good old-fashioned AI was all about substrate independence. And what we are trying to address now is how the hardware, the body, influences what is possible to learn and how the organism or the system is learning. It is useful because we don't need only the humanoid robots. We need all kinds of robots to use them in industry and the applications and so on. We don't need all of them to be on the level of human intelligence, but it could be useful to have such robots, for example, who are on certain level of development equivalent to maybe some animal or similar. And this is Barry Cooper, who comments on the idea that it is enough to know things in abstracto. So he called it the bias of mathematicians, because mathematicians love to formulate things completely abstractly. And he says that it is so that when we go to the idea of computing, which is physical process in the concrete physical sense, the idea of machine as data cannot be used anymore. And also we get the link between mechanics of emergence outcomes to get the supervenience of mentality on the brain functionality. So in order to understand that step, layered architecture of the mind and how we get the function of the brain to produce intelligence and mentality, we should give up the idea that brain is abstract thing, but it has a concrete physical properties which are used to produce this computation, to provide this computation. So this is one more voice in this group to say that we really need natural computing, morphological computing, or non-conventional computing, which is, in my understanding, we can use all the levels that we find in nature, and that's also what we will find in the Handbook of Natural Computing. You can use physical system to perform computation, you can use chemical system, you can use bio system, and so on, cognitive system. And all of them are different levels of organization of in nature. That's why we need transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach in order to learn as much as we can from nature. And we use the insights from, as I mentioned, physics, chemistry, biology, and we synthesize this with the computer science and cognitive science. And that's the idea of Peter Denning as well. He says that computing actually is a natural science. He wants to find grounding for computing in natural sciences. And this slide is about the differences between digital and analog, discrete and continuous, symbolic and sub-symbolic. Those are the details. There was a lot of discussions during the years about, is it possible that mind is computational? And some people who were against this idea would say it is only, computations are always discrete, they are always abstract, and so on and so forth. So there is a very elegant solution for this idea of how to connect sub-symbolic with symbolic. This is from Hofstadter, Douglas Hofstadter, his dialogue from Gödel-Escherbach, where you have both holism and reductionism in one picture, united, explaining that there is no in principle contradiction. And when we think about Turing machines, how could we use Turing machines, and where do they place in the whole big picture of nature and unconventional computing and so on? We can say that, of course, you can use mechanical approach, or you can use like representation, as in this picture of Leonardo's Mona Lisa, which is made of small pictures of some other people. Or you can use Archimboldo's librarian picture as a metaphor of how we can produce representation of something using something completely different. So it's the question of interpreter and the relationship between the interpreter and the what is interpreted. So this is again, we go all the time back to Turing, because he was really an enormously visionary man before his time, and he has really even suggested something which was in the direction of natural computing. He was studying morphology or morphogenesis. So I mentioned this system 1 and system 2 thinking, and the necessity for cognition as well as intelligence to be embodied, embedded, and enacted. So those are the things that we will find if we study the phenomena in a broadened sense. So I say here that today, with increasing insights into details and mechanisms of cognition, it is emerging that human cognition and intelligence are based not only on activities of the brain and nerve cells, but also body, in interaction with the environment. And now we are learning also that not only neurons in the brain contribute to information processing, but also glia or astrocytes and so on, other cells which are in the brain and support and even change and process information. So I provide those two definitions, that cognition is a process of continual being in the world. And in that, I mean, I'm with Maturana and Varela, and there are a number of other people who would say that cognition is synonymous with life. So, and the most elementary unit of life is cell. So we can study cell cognition. And intelligence would be problem solving and learning adaptive behaviors of an agent with an environment, within an environment or a context. So it is mostly ability to solve the problems. While cognition is the whole process of living. And here is the example of a cell with all the inputs and all the outputs. And in between, there are many chemical processes, physical and chemical processes that can be formalized and expressed in terms of languages and computation. And when you look, and I provide some links here, when you look at the workings within the cell, then you see that there is so much mechanical processes going on. So when you look at the transcription processes or a lot of what is happening on the level of molecules, it's really very, very algorithmic, very mechanical. So one would believe that on that level, we must be able to formulate those things computationally. And also, this is one interesting example of very mechanistic details of molecular machinery, which is bacterial flagellar motor. So bacteria has a tail which helps to propagate. And this is really like, there are links which show the details of molecular structures. It's a really very, very mechanical. So on that level, we can say that we can study different sorts of systems in the same framework as information processing or computation in living systems or systems who connected to life. So on the from the level of protein-protein interactions in the yeast cell to the bacterial colony on the second place, and the human brain connectome and the internet internet system, you have a network of nodes which exchange information and change behavior. So I go very quickly because this is a very, very long presentation, and I just want to suggest you the territory and what are the things that are happening there. So if you want to look at the details and the references and everything, it is on the web. But we can say that studying microorganisms, we can find cognitive behaviors. On the level of single cell, we can see behaviors which are cognitive. On the level of plants, I already mentioned there are processes which show us that plants are also cognitive systems. As living systems, they are adaptive. They solve the problems. They learn about the environment, and they change. Also in animal cognition, we can find organisms which are very simple, but already have advanced behaviors and very advanced sensors and actuators and the information processing. So, and of course, the human brain on the highest level of complexity, we can see that we can study, as in the Human Brain Project, from the molecular level, to the circuits and the regions in the brain and the whole brain as the whole. So it's a very complex system, and we are learning to understand, and there is this an ambition with deep learning to be able to somehow achieve abilities as the human brain has. But it's good to remember that all this AI is always, when we are talking about the cognitive architectures for AI, they are always mimicking human brain. They are not on the level of organisms which are lower, but we can learn a lot from, even from those organisms about how information could be processed and how we can get further in developing intelligence. So that's what I already said, that there are biogenic approaches which would say that the cognition is ability of all living organisms, and there are references to Maturana and Varela and Stewart, and there are also anthropogenic approaches that I've forgotten to mention, that's only humans, cognitive agents, and they are new abiotic approaches, and that's what we are trying to achieve with artificially intelligent systems. And how to connect anthropogenic and with biogenic and abiotic cognition, that's one question which is still open. And if you remember Dobzhansky quote that nothing in biology makes sense except for in the light of evolution, then the question is, how much can we go in our understanding of intelligence and cognition and learning without knowing much more about evolution and how those things have been created in this long process of interaction between an agent and the changing environment. So that's an open question. We can say the deep learning is really very successful approach, but it is really limited. And how much do we need to know about real life intelligence and cognition in order to understand better what we can do with machines? This is just the digression about evolution. So you can see this smallest wasp compared to amoeba or paramecium, which are one-cell organisms. And this insect is smaller than the one-cell organism. And it has brain and everything. It's fascinating what evolution is able to produce. But okay, that was on the side of living organisms. And now on the side of our attempts to mimic in cognitive computing by machines which have senses, they learn, they infer or think, and they interact. And there are projects, especially notably in IBM, developing neuromorphic computing with the natural systems as a template. And you see more information about those studies of brain function by IBM. So if we compare cognitive computing and artificial intelligence, there is an overlap, but there are also specific things that are specific for cognitive computing and specific for artificial intelligence. I can show you here. If you look at deep learning, it is a subset of machine learning, which is a subset of artificial intelligence, which is a subset of cognitive computing. But I have seen pictures which show exactly the opposite, the cognitive computing as a subset of artificial intelligence. So it depends from which side you look. And machine intelligence and cognitive computing, they can be shown as networks, knowledge networks which communicate. So it's maybe not which is within the other, but how they connect different fields of our knowledge in the whole. This is also in an illustration, computing in cognitive system, connecting data to intelligent agency, where you have different sorts of natural morphological computing, computer synthesis of natural phenomena, computing with materials or architectures, nature-inspired computing, models of nature. All of them overlap and have some specifics. And back to Turing, I don't need to mention it again, but Turing was the start of the whole idea of computational modeling and also of morphogenesis. So computationalism as a term, it describes our understanding of the function of the brain in the first place in computational terms. And that is changing radically, both because we are not anymore using Turing machine as a model of the brain, and also because we are learning from nature about the details of cognition and intelligence. So here I have an illustration of computing nature and nature inspired computation, just to show you that again we go from subatomic particles, physics, to atoms, to higher levels of organization, and then starting with cells, we have cognitive systems which then have agency and they have goals, and also some would ascribe intelligence to even to those systems. So one interesting author who already in which year, 1991, proposed the computing cells as a self-generating systems. He was claiming that it is a different way of computation when you have a reactive agent which is in constant flow, as the cell is never the same. It is always taking inputs from the outside, making some processing on the level of physics and chemistry and biological things, and it is all the time changing, given input information, both in terms of materia and in terms of pure information. So he said a component system is a computer which, when executing its operations, software builds a new hardware. We have a computer that rewrites itself in a hardware-software interplay. The hardware defines the software and the software defines new hardware. Then the cycle starts again. And that's a very interesting type of computation. And in order to understand how things look like for C. elegans, for example, and how it makes a representation of the outside world and reacts and behaves, this is a reference to the article. So it says that reality for an agent is an observer-dependent reality. And we are claiming all the time that what an agent can have for a knowledge is dependent on its own hardware, or its interface with the world and its information processing within the agent. Now, there is also a theory about the material side, and now I'm running out of time. So I will jump over this. This is very interesting theory of Kaufman and also Deacon. They are thinking in terms of physical and energetic accounts of computation. But I will just run very quickly through the last part, which tells you something about the evolution of a nervous system and how it gets more and more complex. And I come to this new book of Jablonka and Ginsburg, who talk about the evolution of what they call sensitive soul, or the individual personal experience of the world, what is it that makes this conscious experience? Because Bengio was searching for some kind of conscious experience implemented in an agent. And I have proposal to look at many fantastic books which are in the background, which are inspiring and fantastic. And we'll learn a lot about those things, also about computational matter. I didn't have enough time to mention more, and inspired by nature and active matter and so on. Things also natural philosophy is one of components in this whole big picture. So I think in summary, we can say that this idea of moving from system 1 and to system 2 is really very important, and that we have ideas from natural computing and conventional computing that could support this project of learning to move from some sub-symbolic to symbolic. So that's implications. Cognition and intelligence are abilities of all living beings. Cognition is embodied, embedded, and active, extended. For living organisms, cognition is life. Evolution is important to understand in order to understand the development of intelligence, and so on. So I told you all of this already. And there are some open questions like minimal consciousness, exact role of embodiment, new kinds of computational models, and so on. So I will stop here. There are references and there are events organized on those topics and additional materials. So if you have time and if you want, you can look at more as a mathematical model of this infocomputational approach and so on and so forth. So I will stop here. So thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to discuss the idea with you. Thank you. Thanks.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah. Fascinating talk, really inspirational. Thanks very much for that. Really enjoyed it. One of the things you keep mentioning is about thinking of the organism and the organism as embodied in its environment. But of course, the environment comprises lots of other organisms as well. So are you also thinking about higher levels of intelligence at kind of the superorganism level, or multiple organisms becoming an intelligence themselves?
Yes, it's a very, very good question. I think I never thought very deeply about it, but it is a very important thing. We can say that when going from single cell to the multicellular organisms, already on that simple step, we can see what is happening with the intelligence of single cell when it becomes part of the bigger group. And then we can imagine organisms organized in society and social cognition and social intelligence as a high level of information processing. So it's absolutely, it goes as a step above this. Definitely worth of studying.
Can I ask a question, please?
Okay, yes, Michael. Richard, okay, yes.
Yeah, well, thank you firstly. I mean, that was really fascinating. I'd have loved to have had a chance to hear more of that. So thank you very much for a brilliant lecture. You're talking several times about moving from system 1 to system 2. It occurred to me that there are certain situations in which, at some level of abstraction, a human being could be considered to move from system 2 to system 1, whereby a process that initially requires a great degree of concentration through a learning process becomes largely automatic in most situations. So obvious examples would be things like learning to drive or learning to play an instrument. Do you think this sort of concept could have a potential map over to artificial learning systems?
Absolutely, that's a very good comment. I think when I was saying moving from system 1 to system 2 was only in sense that we learn how to make this system 2 work. And then, of course, there is a connection all the time. We have ability to think from the abstract level and affect our feelings, our sensations, everything. You can even change your heart rate by purely thinking on it. Yoga is working on that level. So you just think about something and you can change, you can measure this. That's really, there are experiments on this ability to control your own breathing, your own heart rate, and so on. So it comes from the high level symbolic thinking. I just think I will do that. And then I'm able, it's not really clear how it is done. But yeah, how can we get nervous? Just we think about politics or something, and the heart is beating. We feel this is subsymbolic body reaction on this.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So that's really the idea, to have this connection all the time, bottom up and top down. That's what we have. And each cell also. So because we are open system, we as an organism, we are open biological system, and our parts, our cells are also open systems, which are all the time reacting to the environment.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Michael?
Yes. Gianfranco.
Yes.
Gianfranco.
No,
Okay.
please.
No, Michael, before
Okay.
Gianfranco. Okay, Michael.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I come at things from sort of a phenomenological perspective. And so, I mean, I see very nicely what you're talking about organisms responding to an environment, creative inference, associative learning, all those things, it seems to me, are certainly there. But how does one deal with something like that would be experienced from within consciousness as insight, where one sees a connection that's not simply responding or moving with what Husserl calls passive synthesis, but actually grasping a relationship? Seems it can only be known sort of by reflection on one's conscious processes, maybe a little different methodology, but can you explain insight?
That's also a very, very good question. I would say like this. When we think about how the organism, like a human, let's say on a human level, how do we learn and how do we think? We get information from the outside world, we make memories, and we use memories for prediction and for deliberation, for reasoning. And thinking about something makes it that we visit those connections in our brains, which are connected with the things we have experienced before. Either we have really in the real life learned about it, or we read about it or watch a movie or whatever. There is a record in our brain in terms of connections between our neurons, which will make it resonate. When we start something, it resonates through the system, and we can get the whole reconstruction of those things. And so we can really be affected by the content of our memories and our thinking on those memories. So I think that there is a natural way to understand how we look inside our brain, or how we remember those things that we have memorized. And
Okay.
also, yeah, also when you look at something, it's not the process of perception is connected with the memory. So in order to recognize what we are seeing, we connect it to the memory, but the memory is coloring this, what we are seeing. So there is an interaction between our thinking and our observation or perception as well. So it's connected.
Thank you.
Very good. Now, Gianfranco, I think.
Yes, so, thank you very much for your presentation. Is always fascinating, all this connection. I think that also relating with the last commentary, that is, I prefer to separate cognition from information processing and semantic information processing, because effectively cognition is always related with consciousness. And so to speak about consciousness in cell or in some components of a living cell, I think that is misleading. It's better that we concentrate on what means a signal. That is, I like very much the algebraic approach of Peirce to logic. Indeed, a signal is before a symbol. And what happens in biological matter is essential processes of signaling. Signaling means that something that is physical acquires a significance, is not a meaning in the proper sense of semantics, for instance, in logic. And so, according to me, what is necessary for developing the notion of natural computing is avoiding this anthropomorphic way of speaking about cognition in cell or in biological system, because consciousness is absolutely subjective. Is I talk, that is a first person language, both singular I talk and we talk. And so is, I repeat, is related with consciousness. On the contrary, what we need for developing the notion of natural computation is to deepen the notion of signal. How you pass from a antepredicative way of signaling, and so in which we don't suppose predicates or we don't suppose extension already defined, but for instance, using category theory, we start from algebra and we study how to constitute the domain of a given function or predicate. But it's something that happens at a precognitive level. Of course, our cognition...
May I just comment? I agree with you in that sense that we don't agree. So this is a whole school. You are the representative of the school who would say that we don't like to call those things cognitive. And that's fine. I have seen it very much. Many people think like you, and they would not accept that cell is cognitive system. On the contrary, I see the big advantage.
Potential.
Yeah, a big tension between the two, but also the big advantage in ascribing cognition to the cell. And cognition is not consciousness. Cognition, as Jablonka is saying, they would not say that the cell is cognitive, but they would say that MOSC is cognitive. Some sort of organism which has a nervous system, which is a representation of both the outside world and one's self. So she says this is a self which is thinking of itself. Okay, so the question, if you like to ascribe cognition to the cell, as some people together with me would do, or not, we cannot discuss it. I agree totally that you have right to say I don't like it. Okay, but my proposal is practical, that we are learning how those systems solve problems and how they process information and how they learn. So that's the proposal.
Yes. Okay, okay.
Okay, so I think we must have this break, 10 minutes break, and then begin at 3 o'clock. See, for me it's 3, for us it's 3.
It's
Then...
2. According to the...
Okay.
Okay.
2 or 3, depends on the context.
Okay.
So, if you, I don't know if there are the coffee rooms to discuss more the topics between speakers.
Yes.
But I remain here, Gordana. I agree with you. I think that your paper is wonderful, and I am sympathetic because I think it helps a lot for computing. Precisely for the scope of computing.
Yeah, yeah, and then I understand perfectly Gianfranco's idea or position, because many people would say like this. It's really minority view that cell is that cell is cognitive. It's not many people who would agree, but it is a very new movement, and I have some references here in my.
See, I want to go see to this new reference, Gordana.
Yeah, I will show you. Just a second. In the end, so they are year 21. They are just fresh references.
Yeah.
On this.
Okay. So I see what you write another on the topic. I'm very, very sympathetic with this natural computing.
Yeah, but of course, the question of what you call cognition. If you really feel I cannot call it cognition, that's understandable. But that's the position. That's just the name.
Okay.
So,
we must know
cognition in a wide sense.
Probably the solution is to follow the suggestion of Damasio, saying that the basis of intentionality is not conscious, because intentionality is related with the fact that our cells, or generally living system, are open system, so that are always related with an environment, so that the subject-object relationship inside consciousness is effectively an intercourse, a physical informational intercourse between the system and its environment. And so I think that this recovers also the old idea of Brentano that intentionality is common to all biological systems and is not strictly related with consciousness. This is the phenomenological school, Wussel and so on. But the problem is that our cells, that is, a living system is an open system, so that you cannot consider a living system without its environment. And this is the physical basis of what, at conscious level, we call the subject-object relationship. Subject-object relationship is inside consciousness. On the contrary, system environment, system thermal bath, starting from thermodynamics, is something that is physical. Of course,
yes, we are not conscious about.
And the consciousness is something more with respect to this, because it's a second reflection over the first reflection. That is this relationship with the environment. And so
I think I agree with you. You can have this feeling that you cannot accept such a broadening of the idea of the concept.
Yes, no, but it's only for helping also cognitive science to focalize on the problems that it, according to me, is the problem of signaling, the problem of how to generate from an algebra of relations a logic of predicates. This is very important topics. And if we concentrate there our research, I think that the notion of natural computation is, but I agree with you with everything else, apart from this.
Yeah, I expected a lot of contrary opinions. I'm not surprised. It's normal. It's a received view is that cognition, that's something that humans have. You wouldn't even say that the dog is has cognition.
Yes, because it's conscious, a dog. A dog is conscious.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but some people,
But an amoeba, I don't think that is conscious. That is
I read a philosopher newly. I couldn't believe he does not ascribe cognition to a dog. He says it's only human property. You cannot say any animal has cognition. And for me, I can talk to dog. A dog understands.
Yes, absolutely. And there is an animal intelligence, according to me. Okay. But if you have a nervous system, you have the possibility.
Okay, that's my dog.
Oh, this is your
new dog. Oh, beautiful.
Talk with your dog.
Raffaela, here are the new references, and that's Michael Levin and Pamela Lime. The list.
So, thank you, Gordana. Wonderful talk. Really
Thank you.
Wonderful. Now I give the word to Susan Stepney, if she is ready, from York University.
Yeah, I'll try and...
So, Susan. Hi, Susan. I give the word to you if you want to share your paper.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out...
the representational entity in physical computing.
Thanks. I had this all set up and now I need to move some things around to get it to work. Okay, is that, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Right. Okay,
yes.
And it's gone full screen now, has it? Yeah. Okay. Well, okay, thanks very much for that. And some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about fits in quite nicely with what Gordana was talking about earlier, but I'm going to go down into a bit more detail about one particular aspect, which is this representational entity. And thanks for having me back this year. I was supposed to be talking about this last year, but I don't know, something happened last year. We didn't have the meeting. But in fact, what I'm going to be doing is building on something that we started back in 2014. And at AISB in 2014, I talked about what we actually mean by computing, using something that we called abstraction representation theory. And I'll just quickly go over that because you need to understand that in order to know what I'm going to be talking about in the rest of the talk. And we wanted to do this because there was a lot of people coming up with a variety of unconventional computing materials which were being alleged to compute. And it wasn't obvious whether they were computing or if they were computing, where that computation was happening. And so we developed this just to give us a language really for talking about these ideas. So the idea on is doing computation, which is an abstract thing. So we have a distinction here between the abstract world above the dashed line and the physical world, the world of solid stuff you can kick below the dashed line. And so in the idea here, we start with some computational problem, and we want to do a computation on it to get the computational answer. But we need to use a computer to do that. So how do we do that? So we take our problem and we instantiate it in some physical device. That might require building the device, programming the device, putting data into the device, whatever. And then the device evolves under the laws of physics. Some time goes by until it gets a new state, and we decode that new state as our output, as our answer back into the abstract world. And what we want, obviously, is that the answer to the computation, where notice the dash is in a subtly different place in these two terms, This is the after state of our original problem done as an abstract computation. And this is our model of the after state of our physical device. And if these two are close enough together, so this epsilon here is small enough, we can say that the physical device has computed the abstract problem. And we make epsilon small enough through the usual engineering and debugging processes and so on. So this is the definition of what we mean by a physical device performing an abstract computation. So we use the word computation to talk about abstract things and computing to talk about physical things, just to separate the ideas. So we defined computing as the use of a physical system to predict the outcome of an abstract computational evolution. And we use this idea to distinguish the important differences between science, engineering, and computing, where we can use the same epsilon commuting square, if you like, but in different ways to capture the differences. So within science, we usually start with some physical object that we want to understand, we model it, we calculate things about the model, and what we like is if we've got a good model, then if the physical device itself evolved through time, and then we calculated, decoded what it had done back up into the model, that this square should sufficiently commute. So we start with a physical system, and our goal is to get an abstract model. And if these things don't sufficiently commute, if there's a difference between them, we change the model, we change the abstract level. So physical reality trumps the model in the case of science. We're building a model from reality. Engineering, we can use the same square, but in a very different way. So we start with an abstract model or specification, if you like, of the system we want to build. We instantiate it physically. That physical device behaves in some way. And we can also calculate how that physical device should behave on this dashed line. And we want them to, again, sufficiently commute. And in this particular case, if they don't sufficiently commute, there's a bug, the epsilon is too big, what we do is we change the physical system. In an engineering system, the specification of what we want trumps the physical system of what we've actually got. If they're different, it's the system that's got the bug and needs to be changed. Computing is similar to engineering in this way, but has a slight difference in we want to start at the abstract question and we want to end at the abstract answer. But in exactly the same way as engineering, if these two parts don't actually sufficiently commute, we say that we have to change the physical system. That is, we have to change the computer or the program as instantiated in the computer. So that's just a whistle-stop tour of the original definition. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the representational entity in this system. So we have a physical domain, stuff you can kick. It's the computing substrate. It is physical reality. It's not a model of physical reality. It is the physical reality itself. We have the abstract domain, which is populated with computational models, computational objects. And that is a mathematical, or at least a formal model of something. And then there's a representation relation between these two things, which mediates between the physical and the abstract domain. We say that the abstract model represents the physical system. Now, this is necessarily not a mathematical relation. It can't be a mathematical relation because it's going between the physical domain and the abstract domain. And a mathematical relation has to go between abstract and abstract. So it's not a mathematical relation, and it needs a representational entity to support this relation between this physical domain and the abstract domain. Now, what is this representational entity? We say it doesn't have to be a human or a conscious entity. And in fact, I frankly have no idea what the word conscious means, or consciousness even means. So a lot of arguments about whether or not something is conscious, I just don't even understand the question. But it certainly doesn't have to be human, as I hope to be able to show. So this is just our view of the one of the many models of computation, which is the no computation without representation view. And this not only it helps us explain when or when not some unconventional substrate is doing a computation or not, but it also, in the usual way, explains why the universe isn't computing itself and why rocks don't compute and things like that. So no pan-computationalism here. So that's the background. So what I want to talk about here is how we've added the representational entity itself into the model. The model that you saw so far just sort of had the representational entity supporting the representation relation, but wasn't actually in the model itself. So here, this is the same picture we had before, but drawn with a different drawing program because it gets a bit more complicated. And so rather than drawing it with a simple paint program, drawing it with a proper technical drawing, this is the original diagram I showed you in the first slide of the abstract computation being instantiated in a physical device, evolving through time and being decoded back into an abstract answer. This is the same diagram. Now here I'm using these rounded boxes to denote abstract objects, and the square-cornered boxes to denote physical objects. And this dashed line separating physical and abstract, I will not draw after this because it just clutters the diagram. But it's the same thing. We start with some abstract object that we want to do a computation on. We instantiate it in a physical device. The program runs, the computer computes until it's got some output state that we can see, which we then decode back into an abstract object. And we require that the diagram sufficiently commutes, or epsilon commutes, as we call it here. So that's what we call the compute cycle. But where did this computational problem come from? And so when we start putting that in, we can start seeing where the representational entity appears in this model. So what we say is there is some abstract problem, not a computational problem necessarily, that, that we want to compute something about. In order to do that, we have to encode it as a computational problem. Not all problems, of course, can be encoded as computational problems, but let's say our abstract problem can. And the example I usually give here is my abstract problem is I've got 2 apples in one hand and 3 apples in another hand, and I want to know how many apples I've got in total. I then encode that in an abstract computational problem of what is 2 plus 3. And then similarly, we decode the computational answer back into a suitable abstract answer. So when I've computed that 2 plus 3 equals 5, I've got 5 here, and then I decode that to be 5 apples. So that's my abstract answer. So what we do is we identify this abstract problem as being the representational entity's actual problem, not a computational problem, but the actual problem the representational entity has. I put our model of in brackets because if we can't interrogate the representational entity, we have to just model what we think is going on and check everything works. So this abstract problem is the representational entities problem prior to it being encoded as a computational problem. So let's look at this part of that diagram in a little bit more detail to see how we can include the representational entity into the model. So here we've got that previous part of the diagram elaborated a bit more. So here we've got our computational problem, then instantiated into our physical computer. So this is kind of the left-hand side of the computational cycle, the square. Then we've got the representational entity's abstract problem. It was called A on the previous slide. It's now got a slightly more sophisticated name, and which I will explain. And then we've got the representational entity itself, the physical representational entity down here. So now I'm still using the rounded boxes to mean abstract and the square corners boxes to mean physical, but now I'm using dotted boxes to mean representational entity and solid boxes to mean computer. So this is the abstract problem, or it's our model of the representational entities problem. And this is the representational entity, or the part of the representational entity corresponding to the problem, the bit of my brain that's wondering how many apples I have in my hands. So that part, the P means physical, RE is the representational entity subscript, is represented as a model of the physical representational entity. That abstract problem gets encoded as a computational problem, if it can be. And that becomes, at the physical level, it's physically encoded into the physical computer. It's encoded into the part of the computer holding the problem. So I might physically encode my problem by pressing the 2 + 3 = keys on a calculator, say, presumably after I've put the apples down. So that's the way that the link between the representational entities problem, which is not a computational problem, not expressed computationally, it has to be encoded into the computer in order to be solved by the computer. So we can take this idea of having the representational entity sort of forming a complement to the physical computer, and we can draw out the whole system like this, which is a bit complicated, so I will go through it relatively slowly in some detail. But the idea is that the representational entity's desired computation is a kind of a shadow of the compute cycle. So the front part here we've seen before, and I'll go through what the rest of that is going on. So the front face of this cube is that compute cycle that we've seen before. This is a model of the physical computer down at the bottom and its abstract computation that it's performing at the top. And that abstract computation is implemented as an instantiation, a physical evolution, and then a reading the output. So that's what we saw before. This left face is what we've just seen, the physical computer and the representational entity's view of that problem. So this was what was called A before, physical entity, our model of its problem, the encoding of that problem into the computer model, and then the instantiation of the computer model into the physical computer. Is our way of understanding what this physically encoding the problem is here. But we can explore what all the other faces mean, and they've all got an interpretation as well. So for example, the back face is this shadow compute cycle. The physical entity, its model of its problem, its kind of informal desire for an answer. It's not a computation, we're not in the computational domain yet. And then its physical brain state or physiological state that changes as a result of it knowing the answer to its problem. And the right face is kind of the mirror of the left face. The left face was putting the problem in, the right face is getting the answer out. So the physical computer has an answer, it's represented as a computational answer, it's decoded into an abstract answer, which is gets instantiated in the state of physical entity, or we can say the physical entity just physically decodes the answer from the computer. I look at the calculator and I see a pattern on it that I physically decode as 5, and my brain now has the answer 5 inside it for the number of apples. The top is purely abstract computation. So if we were just in the world of models, it's our model of the problem, our encoding that problem into a model of the computation, doing the computation abstractly into a an abstract answer, then decoding that abstract computational answer into an abstract answer that suits the abstract entity, which gives us the result of the abstract entity knowing the result going on the back face. So the bottom layer is the purely physical use of the computer without any of this modeling nonsense. It's exactly what's going on physically. The entity physically encoding the question into the computer physically computing the answer, and then the entity physically decoding it. And then that gives us the explanation for the change in state of the physical system that now knows the result of that computation. So it can't, whoops, sorry, that's it. It goes round the loop like that, physically encodes, uses the computer, physically decodes. And then the whole cube we can say is now our model of what is going on when the representational entity uses a computer to find the answer to a problem. So the physical entity has a problem. This is our model of that problem that is then encoded as a model of the desired computation, instantiated in a physical computer, which physically evolves through time to give a physical answer, which is represented as our abstract answer, decoded into the abstract answer for the entity, which then explains the entity's final brain state. So that's the way that we can formally put the representational entity into this model of what a physical computation is. So what kinds of representational entity exist? Now, obviously, they can be humans. You can have a problem in your head as a brain state. You can encode it into a computation. You can instantiate and run that computation on some external computer, or you can instantiate it and run it in your head. You can do mental arithmetic. You might have noticed that when I said that 2 + 3 = 5, I didn't actually stab the numbers into a calculator and read off the answer. I did actually run that one in my head. But then you can decode the result into another brain state so that your brain state now has the answer. And that's kind of almost the trivial case. It's easy to see that the human is a representational entity, that they're holding the representation of the problems, that they're encoding into computers and decoding the results that are coming out, and that their brain state is changing. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a computer. So here's an example of intrinsic bacterial computing. And I'm very pleased that Gordana mentioned the bacterium flagella, because that's exactly the approach that's going on here. Now, I call this intrinsic bacterial computing because what I want to show is how a bacterium can be considered to be computing for itself, that the bacterium is the representational entity. Now, there are some forms of unconventional computing where we humans engineer bacteria to do computing for us. And in those cases, the bacterium is the computer and the representational entity is the human who's engineered it. But in this particular case, I want to argue that the bacterium is both the computer and the representational entity. So the problem that the bacteria wants to solve is it wants to move towards food. So if we go around the loop that I showed before, here is the bacterium as the representational entity, or the part of the bacterium that's kind of representing the I want to move towards food. And so it's our model of what it's doing there is it's asking, is there any food around? And if the answer is yes, it wants to move towards the food. So that's what it wants to do, or in fact, physically, it wants to move towards the food. So physically, if there is food, it physically wants to move towards it. So it needs to encode that, that problem, that abstract problem, into some kind of computational problem. And it's just some signaling here. So it encodes that into a particular signal. Is there a signal? Not is there food, but is there a signal that's signaling food, which gets instantiated in the physical system as some chemical X. And the computation then is, if this chemical X appears, so it's physically encoded by actually a receptor that can receive that chemical, there is then a signaling pathway until you get to a chemical Y. And this signaling pathway moves from the front to the back of the bacteria, and the front where the sensors are to the back where the flagella is. And so if the signal appears, you get to the back, which moves the flagella. And so if we get a chemical Y, we can say the answer is yes, motor is on. And that's decoded as yes, I'm moving. And then that becomes I move towards the food. And looking just at the bottom, physically encoding the chemical, signaling pathway, physically decoding as a moving flagella. So it's very simple signal processing, but I want to argue that this is actually computing and not just the bacterium doing its physical thing. Now, the whole point of coming up with this in the first place was to, coming up with this model in the first place was to distinguish between physical systems just being physical systems and doing their physical thing, and physical systems actually performing computations, actually doing computing. And when you've got a representational entity that you can interrogate, that's easy because you can ask what all these representation relations are. And you can ask whether the representation entity is supporting these representations. So what is supporting this representation between signal and chemical X and motor on and chemical Y? Well, it's and is it a representation or is it just a physical thing? Well, we can argue that it's a representation simply because these chemicals are in some sense arbitrary. You can change the chemicals. Different bacteria use different chemicals and have different signaling pathways. So it's not the physical chemical that's important, it's the use of that chemical as a signal that's important. And so the way we can demonstrate that there is a representation is through the arbitrariness of which chemical is used by the bacteria to instantiate that representation. So this is what you have to do if you can't actually interrogate the representational entity and say, is this a representation? You actually have to show it's arbitrary. Now, an example of something that's not arbitrary, for example, might be photosynthesis, where there's a photon absorbed by a leaf, which sort of the energy packet, the photon bops around inside until it gets to the right place. Now, that's not arbitrary. You can't replace the photon with some other signal because it's the intrinsic energy of that photon that is important. But in this particular case, it's not the intrinsic properties of that particular chemical. It's the way that chemical is used in a signaling pathway, and you can have different signaling pathways. Okay, so that means that you can have non-human kinds of representational entity. So you can have non-human intrinsic computing. And this is the bacterium problem of finding food. The representation, I said, is arbitrary because you can use different molecules, and it's an embodied system. It's an embodied representation there. So this is the diagram I showed early on, the distinction between science, engineering, and computing. And by adding the representational entity into the system, we've got a fourth column, which is I've called life, and simply saying that the system at the back, the representational entity, is using a computer, be it an external computer or part of itself, in order to solve a problem. And we can see it's a form of computation or a form of, rather than a model of a scientific process, by saying what needs to change if this process doesn't sufficiently commute. And because it's actually trying to solve a specific problem, if that doesn't actually work, we have to change the physical computer or the model of the physical computer if we've modeled incorrectly what it is that the computation is. But it's the computer that needs to change. So this fits in very nicely to some of the things that Gordana was saying in her talk. Is it the case that a representational entity has to be a living system somewhere, or I've said somewhere in the process? The representational entity is essential for there to be computing happening. As I said, there's no computation without representation in this model. And as I've also said, it doesn't have to be human. It can be bacterium, it can be other life. But does it have to be life? How far can the concept of the representational entity be removed from being a living user? So, for example, one of the things we're working on at the moment is using this model to explain a control system. The computer is a control system has both a plant and a computer. Sorry, plant is nothing to do with living, growing green things. It's the factory or the whatever is being controlled. And we can say that in that system, the plant acts like the representational entity. What it wants to do is use the computer to control its process to do a particular thing. However, it's a proxy representational entity that was designed by a human engineer somewhere in the process. So we say that although we might be able to point to something that looks like the representational entity that isn't a living system, there was a living system somewhere in the process. It might be several levels of proxies or engineers, representational entities away, but we think that there needs to be a living system somewhere because of this need for representation. So we're saying no representation without life. And then looking at the other way round, saying to be alive is to be a representation entity. All living systems compute, although it's certainly true that not everything they do is computing. A lot of what they're doing is sort of maintenance due to being a sorry, someone's coughing. That's not me. So not everything a living system does is computing. There's lots of stuff to do with just maintaining the physical system, but we can use the cube model to demonstrate when what they're doing is a kind of computing. Now, at the moment, all non-human living systems perform only intrinsic computing. Sorry, could whoever's coughing mute themselves, please, because it's very distracting. Sorry. So I think it was Gianfranco.
Yes.
Sorry, it's...
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry.
I agree completely with you.
Yeah. I'm nearly finished anyway. So, yes, so we can use the cube to demonstrate when they are computing. And if you're not a human and a living system on Earth, you're only doing intrinsic computing, but you're doing quite a lot of that as process of your life. But we humans also build these extrinsic computers that we don't have to do all our computing in our heads or with our bodies. We can also use these extrinsic computers. So as well as having no computation without representation and no representation without life, we also claim, and this fits in with what Gordana was saying, that there's no living without computing. And the cube model allows us to demonstrate when that computing is happening. Okay, so that is me finished. I'm a few minutes early, but that gives us longer to actually have a discussion if we want to. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan, for your very, very beautiful talk, very interesting talk. And I ask people if there There are questions about this talk.
Sorry, a question. You, Gianfranco, you spoke. Congratulations for your presentation, with which I agree completely. And what a question is, you spoke about computing, but which type of computing, analog or digital computing? Because this is the but. Because you know that the problem of coding is strictly related with the problem of passage from nature, who is an analog computer, and our intelligence that is digital. And all the problems of Gödel, for instance, numbering and so on, is strictly related with this passage between analog and digital computing.
Yeah.
And
so the model is relative to a computational model. Mm-hmm. So the top line of what computation that you want to do is with respect to some computational model. And we don't say what that model is. It could be an analog model, it could be a digital model. It doesn't matter. So it could be a Turing model, it could be a reservoir computer, it could be anything along there. So it doesn't matter. The model that we've built is to try and define when some form of computing is happening relative to some computational model, whichever computational model that is.
Mm-hmm. So, but the problem is that the problem of coding, because it's different coding is in analog process or in digital process. And this is because, for instance, if you have to pass from a continuous signal to a digital signal, you have the problem of threshold. No, you make a symbolic, and so you can transform any continuous signal in a digital 0-1 signal. But the problem is how to put your threshold, because the problem of thresholding is the core, according to me, of the coding in this sense.
So that's the job of the representation entity, is what is the representation relation. And again, this model is agnostic about what that relation is. It just has to exist. So it has to work. And that's why the square has to, what we say, sufficiently commute. And so it's a debugging process and so on. And so if the square doesn't commute, there's a bug somewhere in the system, and it might be you've put the wrong threshold. It might be that the system doesn't actually evolve through time the way you think it does. It might be that your system cannot support the particular computational model that you've got. There's lots of places where there can be a bug, but the model has abstracted away from those details, and it simply says, in order for this to be a computer, this square has to sufficiently commute. And there's obviously lots of technical details hidden in all those lines. But once you've got that sufficiently commuting, then it's a computer.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions? Now, the problem is philosophical, what we understand by life. That is the problem.
Yes.
A stone, for example, a stone doesn't compute in your...
And this, and we can say exactly in this model where that doesn't work. It's because the top line is the computation, and in some sense the bottom line is the computing, but the two representations are important. Mm-hmm. And in the Putnam stone example, all the computation happens in the representation from the final state of the stone to the abstract model, and everything happens in there. And I think last time I explained this, I gave a little example of, you know, the classical paradox of a clock that stopped is right twice a day, whereas one that's 5 minutes slow is never right. that is completely false, and this model shows why. One, that a clock that is 5 minutes slow is always right as long as you know it's 5 minutes slow, because when you do the representation, you add the 5 minutes on. And so, you know, it's the representation of looking at one of these things and working out what time it is quite a computation. The actual watch itself is not doing very much work. It's just measuring the time. Most of the computation happens in that decoding stage. And if it's 5 minutes slow, or for some of you guys, in fact, it looks like it's an hour slow, but it's right for me. Then you can do that. Whereas if it's stopped, the only way you can know when you look at it whether that time is right or not is by using another clock. In other words, all the computation is being done in that decoding stage, all of it, not a little bit of it. And that's exactly the same with Putnam's rock, is that all the computation is happening in that decoding step. And so it's not the rock that's doing the computation, it's you doing the or the representation.
Oh, okay. So I was.
Yeah. And similarly, the universe computing itself, again, there is no representational entity. It's not computing itself, it's just being a physical object.
Okay. Thank you.
I see some hands up. Michael is the next hand up. You're mute.
Yes, thank you very much for your fine presentation. I just wonder if, as you explain what you're doing, it seems like you do make references to life. You talk about animals wanting food or humans wanting food. And it strikes me there's a kind of level of, to put it in the phenomenological terms, there's a kind of level of the life world lived experience. But what you're offering is, in a sense, an explanatory model or theory that explains those things, and therefore the representational entities, whatever they are sort of neutral, because it really is encompassing in its explanatory power. Would that be correct?
I'm sorry that I think you're a philosopher, and I didn't really quite understand some of the. I'm a computer scientist.
Yeah. So, I mean, you were talking about things like animals wanting food or us wanting food and seeing signals and wanting to know if we have a handful of fruit and how much this is going to weigh, et cetera. Those are sort of what Husserl would call everyday life experiences, which we start with, but then science itself involves a certain kind of abstractive approach that gives an explanatory account of all those kinds of processes and therefore they're kind of neutral with regard to whatever the representational entities are. Would that be an accurate description?
Okay. I'm still not sure I understand it, but I will have an attempt to answer, which is I gave some very, very simple examples just for the point of illustration. Now, obviously, with the bacterium, we don't know really what it's doing, and so in that case, it is an explanatory account of what the bacterium is doing, but that explanatory account is couched as a computation and can be explained as a computation. Yeah, but that was why I was quite careful to say it's our model of what that representational entity is, because we can't ask it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Gianfranco has his hand up, but he's not there. So.
Okay. Any other answer? Question?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
Gordana?
Gordana?
I have a provocative question. How would you comment Rodney Brooks' intelligence without representation?
It might be possible to use this model to find where there is actually some representation hiding in the system, is what I would say. But of course, I can say that because I haven't actually gone and done it, but that would be my guess.
Thank you.
Okay. I wonder if there are other questions, or you want to have a break and.
Zoran's got his hand up.
Zoran.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Now I wonder if you want to all have a break and then be back at 3.
Yeah, but can Zoran ask his question first?
Other questions?
Zoran ask his question first.
If okay with everyone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. I remember, Susan, the first time I've seen this graph, two-dimensional, was when we met in Canada. Do you remember?
Oh
And
yes.
I've seen you made remarkable progress on it. And so this is really fascinating. Okay, this idea with representation entity. I'm just trying to understand what it is. So it's sort of a meta layer on the way we think about computation, right? It's something that is free from representation. It's something that is free from the way we actually try to envision it. It's just there, right?
Sorry, what is the it in that? Sorry, the
Yeah, that's the it is what I'm trying to understand. Yes. So when you think about computation, a problem that is being solved. So question is, of course, we always representing these things, right? We say, okay, we are computing a function, but function on what? What is changing to what, right? So somebody has to do the hard work and actually envision it and represent it, and that is the representation entity, right?
Yeah. So I think an example is if you think of the calculator.
Right.
When I've pressed in 2 + 3 =, then on the face of the calculator, a little light lights up, or a little. If you go back to the old LCD or LED,
Abacus, right?
There'll be a little sign like that on the screen. That's just a few lights on the screen. It's a physical device with a few lights on the screen. Why on earth does that say 5? And what does it, and again, like with looking at my watch in order to say that it's 2:45 or 4:45 or whatever, that it doesn't. That's just 2 physical pieces of metal in a particular configuration. So the representational entity is the one that's supporting the representation from the physical pattern, or just the physical stuff, to the abstract model that says 5. It's really very difficult to talk about this stuff, and I hope all the real philosophers agree with me. It's difficult to talk about this stuff because I'm trying to say that the bottom line of this is the actual physical device. Whereas, of course, when I'm talking about it, I've got a picture, i.e. a model of the physical device. And
but this is actually a fascinating idea, because you're saying that the computation can exist on its own without physical representation, yes? Are you saying that?
I'm saying there is a representational entity who, and possibly also us, who has a model of what that physical thing is. I'm not a Platonist. I'm not saying that this thing actually exists somewhere. I'm saying that's our model of it, and what that means to say that that's our model of it is above my pay grade. I'm just a computer scientist.
And it probably was what defines it, yes? In the moment you start arguing what the model of it is, it also defines it.
Yeah.
But can something exist without a model, yes?
But you could have a completely different representation and get a different answer, which is again where Putnam's rock comes in, because everything's done in that representation, and the representation is what defines the right answer. And in fact, it doesn't matter what's down at the bottom; it's just what's at the top. But it's the old thing of does a high voltage represent 1 or 0? There's a certain arbitrariness in that representation.
Yeah. Thank you. Fascinating.
Yeah. So is it time for a break now?
Susan, I think we can, if you like, have a break, and okay, and then we meet in 10 minutes. Okay, so see you all later. Ciao.
Hi, Zoran.
Hello. How are you doing?
Great.
surviving these times. Yes.
Yes.
We all try.
How is in Sweden now the situation with the university COVID and so on?
It's tough, yeah. It's tough, not easy. So
Not easy.
we try to do teaching as nothing happens, and it costs, right? In terms of the energy you have to spend on giving lectures, and so most of the lectures, they are actually all lectures are basically going over distance.
The same. We have. It depends on the time, because sometimes we are in the orange zone, sometimes in the red zone. In the orange zone, some young people can go to school, and but university most is online courses, distance. This is the situation. Oh, Zoran, 1 minute to begin.
So the same format, right? Around 40 minutes and then discussion.
Yes, it depends on you for discussion, and we have a little bit another break, and then again for the last talk. So I introduce you at Zoran Concoli from Chalmers University. Okay, I give you the word.
Thank you, Raffaela.
Thank you.
So first of all, a big thanks to the conference organizers and the symposium organizers for giving me a chance to present my work. I'm really grateful. But for, even maybe more important, I'm really grateful that you actually brought this conference to my attention. I have to begin by saying that. Voltaire, I think, used to say that common sense is not so common, right? And there is all this talk about interdisciplinary research, how important it is. And actually, I don't think it is that common. So I'm really happy that there is actually a group of dedicated group that fights these trends, because I think, alas, in science, the more you think, the more punished you get these days, yes? So I'm really happy. So thank you. So I'm going to be telling you about on the use of collaborative interactions for embedded sensing applications. I know it's a mouthful, okay, but I'm going to actually dissect the title. So you will see what this thing is about. So most of the hard research, yes, has been done by Vasilis Athanasiou. So he was my PhD student, brilliant person, brilliant scientist. And now he actually moved, he's a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute. So here are his contact details in the case if you're interested. So let's go on, let's begin our journey. So before I begin, right? So Gordana, she told us about cognition, where to find it, and actually that you can find it in the most unusual places, okay? And then Susan told us about that, a lot about representing computation and hidden profound issues when you start really thinking about the problem. Okay, so now I'm going to focus a little bit on the physical side. Okay, keeping all these aspects in mind. So let me show you what I have in mind. Okay, so here is the outlooks. Okay, so I realized that this conference is actually interdisciplinary. Okay, so I gauge my talk so that I give a very broad scope of the work I've done and why have I done it. Okay, so ideas that basically these things that are marked in bold, right, that everybody should be able to follow. And then at the very end of the talk, if time allows, we see whether there is interest for that. Then I suspect that I will lose some of you, okay? But that will be a very minor part of the talk. Okay. And then conclusions, that should have been bold, right? Everybody should understand conclusions. So let's go about why, okay? So there are 3 fundamental questions that I always ask myself. Okay. So by training, actually, I'm a physicist. I did my undergraduate in physics. Okay. And then I got bored with it, so I changed my area, and I actually did my PhD in quantum chemistry, believe it or not, okay? And then I got bored, and then I changed field again, and I went to statistical physics, and then to biological physics. And then there was actually part of my activity that had to do with understanding computation. I was always curious about it. And then eventually that hobby of mine became a profession. Okay, and these are actually 3 questions that brought me into the field, right? So what I was, as I matured, my questions matured, right? So first question I wonder about is, given the physical system, what sort of computation can it do? And then later on, I learned after reading, following the literature, that this is actually an implementation problem in cognitive science, right? And it has a profound practical implications. So, we have spent vast resources on developing engineering skills that we can build actually plethora of systems for various purposes that are not necessarily meant for computation. And the question is, can we use these systems to actually do computation anyway? So I'm talking about missing opportunities. And then there is also important thing is what controls the computing capacity of a dynamical system. So are there features that actually we can leverage, focus on and leverage to actually increase the computing capacity of a dynamical system? And then, lately, actually, what I started thinking about is this idea of accidental computation. Does it exist? How to identify it and actually how to harvest it? Okay, so these are the 3 big questions that I like to think about a lot. And so let's zoom in on some practical aspects, right? You all know the story of Thales, yes, of Milet. He was accused of loving philosophy too much and neglecting real life. Basically, people said to him, "You're wasting your life, right? There is no use of your philosophy." But of course, we all know how the story ended, because then he bought all these olive presses or something like that, right? And then he could earn a lot of money because he expected a good harvest, right? So he actually showed people that philosophy can have extremely practical importance. So here I would like to talk about things practical with these philosophical questions. So there is this talk about Internet of Things, and I believe it's going to be reality very, very soon, right? But there the problem is that it is the flow of information. So normally we gather data on one end, right? And then we have to transport it to some analysis information processing center, and then we draw a conclusion, right? So what you would like to have actually is that you gather information and process it at the same time, and then you send the result of computation. This is much faster, right? And much easier. So what I'm talking about is really idea of the intelligent sensing substrate. So let me see if I can get my pen actually. Laser pointer. So here, the intelligent sensing substrate. So this is the term I'm going to come back to later on, okay? And then of course, this begs the question of resource efficient computation, because we know that a modern computer is guzzles, energy like gasoline, like a car uses gasoline. So we want to build computers that are low power, for example. And then also there is this issue of actually reusing existing structures. So we already have vast engineering skills as a society, and we know how to build things. We know how to build many things for various purposes. And I wonder about these missing opportunities. Are there systems actually that we can identify and use for computation? Okay. So these are extremely, I believe these are extremely relevant questions. Okay. So let's go on. So, from Gordon, this slide actually, I know it clicked. There's, for this connecting data to intelligent agency, this is always the problem, right? So this is actually the issue I'm trying to address with my work a little bit, okay? And this is also from Gordon, and there is this idea of a computer that programs itself. So and it changes itself, right? So as it changes itself, program changes, and so it goes on. I think this is a very exciting idea, and you will see certain aspect of it later on. Okay, I would just like to remind you of that transparency from Gordon now. And here it comes, right? So when I was thinking about these things, what a system can do, I was completely shocked when I stumbled across this theorem by Putnam, and you all know it, right? To me, it was a great revelation. Okay, so basically the background is if I understand it correctly. So his idea was to criticize the thesis of computational sufficiency in cognitive science. And there is this idea that suitable computational structure should enable mind, and that mental states are just different computational states. So if you look at the human brain, well, you can think of it, well, it's a computer running, and therefore, you know, if you have a sufficiently complex thing computing, then you have a mind, consciousness, and whatnot, right? And then, okay, so he attacked that idea in the most amazing way. Okay, I like paradoxes, and this was really something spectacular. So he actually proved the theorem that any system can implement any finite state automaton, and automaton with I input and output. Okay, so it's a profound statement. I'm sure you're aware of it. And basically, if you look at the proof, so it's a very convincing proof, right? It's basically a recipe how you can, and here Susan knows more about that than me, right? It's a recipe for linking the states of any physical system with the states of any finite state automaton. So he basically solved a representation issue, right? And I think, Susan, in your talk, you're basically referring to this front surface, right? So this is where this is happening, okay? Now, why is this a paradox? It basically tells you that, well, you do not need a computer, right? It's so expensive. So just grab a rock and then you have a computer. And if you want a computing cluster, then just grab a bunch of rocks, right? And you're happy, you're good to go. So, and what is the requirement on a system is extremely minimal, right? So you just have to be able to measure one aspect of a system, one variable that should be non-cyclic. Okay, if you have a variable like that, then you can realize any automaton. And basically, for example, if you measure the amount of radioactive carbon isotope, every material has it, right? This is how we date things. So that you could use. Okay. And then, of course, I was curious about it, so I followed up the literature. So this work by David Chalmers, not because I work at Chalmers, but actually there is a person, right, with the last name Chalmers, who actually criticized or responded to this Putnam's challenge. So these two papers, actually, I read in detail, you know, from letter to letter, really studied them. And I just quote from one of these papers. So David Chalmers says, I argue that Putnam's argument fails, but that it points out the need for a better understanding of the bridge between the theory of computation and the theory of physical systems. Wow, I mean, this is goldmine. I'm a physicist interested in computation, perfect, okay? So I couldn't resist of getting my hands dirty, okay, with this thing. So in my response to that thing came in 2015, in a paper entitled A Perspective on Putnam's Realizability Theorem in the Context of Unconventional Computation. Okay, so I believe that this Putnam's theorem challenges the whole field of unconventional computation in the most fundamental way. Okay, it shakes our very ground, right? It questions the reasons for our existence in a way. And so to solve that problem, actually, I formulated another paradox, another problem, right? That I like to call the natural computability problem. So what is this about? It's about balances, how you achieve computation. So given a physical system, identify the automaton or automata that it naturally implements. So what do I mean by natural implementation? So the natural implementation results in the largest computing power and has the lowest realization cost. Okay, you might think it obvious, but when you start thinking about, you know, in a paper, I discuss few thought experiments on different systems. Yeah, taking a rock to begin with, right? And it actually, there's a very systematic way of thinking about it. So I'd like to show you a figure, right? So coming from statistical physics, we like free energy there, right? So free energy, normally here you have the internal energy of the system, and here you have the heat, the entropy part, right? So now this is what I suggest is a semi-qualitative, maybe semi-quantitative way of describing the whole thing. So the first term, right, it actually describes the complexity of the computation. So if I pick automaton, it has certain logical depth, right? So that might be used as a measure to express how complicated it is, the algorithm. Okay. So that is the complexity of the computation, and we want this to be as large as possible. But then it also, this computation, to harvest it from device, you have to engineer it. So there is equipment around it, but I'm not interested in this in a physical sense, but rather in the logical depth sense. So what sort of computing you have to do to extract actually what is in the device, right? And there is a cost. And here, when you start thinking about it, right, when you start plotting these contributions, you realize there is something interesting going on. So this dashed line here, it actually represents the, so imagine that I align along the a-axis, I align more complex automata, right? And then you expect that, sure, the complexity, the logical depth of these automata is going to grow, right? So at this very, very corner, for example, you can imagine an automata that does absolutely nothing. Okay, it's empty set. Okay, you can't get more stupid than this, I think. Okay, so this is vacuum in the sense of computing, nothing. Okay, and then in the far end, maybe you have a deep neural network. Okay, and so there is this contribution that grows up. Yeah. And then, it certainly is the case that if you want to extract something that is more and more complicated, the cost of doing that should actually decrease like this, right? Increase, but I have an additional minus sign. So that is why these curves go down. So what you know it from gymnasium mathematics, yes, that such a thing, when you combine these two contributions, it has to have a maximum. And this maximum actually is the automaton that the device naturally implements. This is the right balance. Okay, so what is the problem? So Susan told us a little bit about the problem with the rock, right? Why we can't use a rock to make a computer. But here in this graph, basically, say you want to use a rock to implement extremely complex algorithms. So which means in terms of algorithmic complexity, you will be somewhere here, very, very high up, right? And of course, the problem is because for rock, this curve is very steeply going downward, right? So this maximum would be somewhere in the far end of the very low complexity, very simple algorithms, right? So this explains why you cannot use the rock, right? Okay. So next one is I would like to discuss another idea. Okay, that I believe is a solution to implementation problem, and this is the idea of reservoir computing. So I don't know how familiar you are, so I'm going to guide you very, very slowly through how the whole thing works. So normally reservoir computing, we all refer to it as a liquid state machine or echo state network. So these are the terms that you will find in the literature, okay? An idea is very simple, actually. Idea is that every system has an inherent capacity for computation, and we call it reservoir. And we just need to harvest that computing power, and we do it by actually using a readout layer. So let me show you how historically the whole idea developed. Okay, so here you have a neural network in the panel A, right? And it's taken from this review paper. So we have inputs. We try to train our neural network. How do we train it? Okay, well, there are weights that we can change in a network. So basically what we do something that is called supervised learning. I'm sure you know what it is, yes? So I know, for example, if I want to train the network to recognize cats from dogs, yes? So I know what the input is and I know what output is. So say when the network is exposed to picture of a dog, it should say 1. When I show it picture of a cat, it should tell -1, right? So I can always see what is the error I'm making. And then because of that, then there are actually algorithms, you know about them, yes, to actually change these weights. Now, historically, what happened actually when people looked at how these algorithms perform, they realized that these weights in the far right corner, these very last weights, that these are the ones changing the most. Okay. And then the next thought was, oh, well, maybe then what we can do the next thing. And this is this thing here. So you see in bold, I'm only changing these weights, but I'm leaving this thing as it is. And there was a big insight that for certain types of networks, actually this thing works. Right. So, and we know exactly which properties the networks have to have. You know, essentially, you know, to make it less technical, it has to be a system that operates at the edge of chaos. So you want something that is extremely responsive, but not too chaotic. Because if it's chaotic, then you can't figure out anything. Okay. So basically, cartoon of this thing, of this idea, is this figure here. Okay. So you have an input. You want to analyze it. There is a dynamical system. So dynamical system has a certain state. Okay. X of t changes in time, and then we just equip it with a readout layer, and then we produce output. So this is the extremely simple idea of reservoir computing. Okay. And so basically what reservoir does, what this system does, it acts as a filter. So let me just explain what the filter is if you're not familiar with it. So say that I have a signal and I want to figure out whether the signal is varying or whether it is stable. Okay. So time perspective is extremely important on that. You always see the past. So say that I'm at this time instance, okay? So what you look here, as a human, you would say, I assume that you do not see that part over here. So you just see the part to the left. So we are here, okay? So I look to the left and I see periodic signal, yes? So then I would say, yeah, the output has to be 1. I'm seeing periodic signal. And then I move a little bit further to the right. Okay, it is still 1. And then I move a little bit to, and here it starts changing, right? It starts stabilizing, so I'm not sure. So I'm between maybe 1 and 0, okay? And then when I'm here, I see, this is completely stable, so the output should be 0, and so on, right? So here at the far end, oh yeah, it is actually changing, so the output should be 1. So that is a filter, okay? What I just described is a filter. I'm trying to check the time, okay. Let me see. So here's the idea, right? So idea was actually to try to use reservoir computing to develop very, very advanced sensing applications. And to do that, I suggested this algorithm, sweet algorithm, and then you can see a link that I pasted in chat. Right, so you can check the paper if you're interested in. And idea is actually to avoid this linear flow of information that you have in the traditional sensing setup. So what do you have in traditional sensing setup? Well, you have environment you want to analyze, right? And then you expose it to a bunch of sensors, and then you collect the data, and then you make the analysis, right? And then you have this problem of a data transfer. You have a linear flow of information. So idea is actually what I suggested was different, right? It is that a dynamical system in a way acts like it absorbs the information from the environment through interaction. And then instead of actually doing the analysis directly on the environment, you basically do the analysis on the dynamical system. And you do that by something that in physics we call the linear response theory. But of course, this problem is heavily nonlinear, but the idea comes from there, right? So basically what you do, once the system has adopted certain state, depending on the environment it experienced, right, then you can actually try to drive certain input through it and then measure the output. So basically when you compare the input-output pairs, that should give you a clue about what the environment looks like. So it's sort of idea of indirect sensing, okay? And actually, this is the way of implementing this intelligent sensing substrate, okay? And here you can find the details. So let me rephrase this in a simple terms, okay? So here we have a normal reservoir computer. Just to refresh you on that, okay? You have an input system, you cannot change, you cannot train it, you cannot do anything with it. The only thing you can adjust is a readout layer, psi, okay? So basically, somebody's giving me a challenge, right? Somebody's telling me, this filter, I want to distinguish between stable and varying signals. Okay, so that's a challenge to me. So in reservoir computing, what we do, we just try to optimize psi. And there are theorems under which conditions you can actually find such a psi, right? So what I'm suggesting is different, okay, slightly different. So here is actually, here we know the input, right? completely in reservoir computing, but when you do sensing, you do not know what your input is. You would like to infer it. So it's hidden from you. So what I can do, however, I can actually drive the system with a carefully optimized drive signal, okay, to infer what this thing looks like. So that's the idea, right? So now the challenge is the following, right? In the sweet sensing setup, the challenge is slightly the following. So we know what the filter I want to construct is. For example, I want to measure something about the environment. Is it varying? Is it stable? So I know what the filter is, right? So I want to reproduce this equality by actually varying the readout layer psi and by varying this drive signal. That is extremely important for the idea. Okay. So I don't know if you're familiar with the filter notation, but basically what this thing says is that if you have equation like that, right, dynamical system, then this realizes a filter. Okay. And I would like to just to tell you about the possibilities we have explored. So some past and future applications of the SWIT algorithm. So many of these things have been developed within the scope of the EU FET Open project that I coordinated. And here you can find the link in the chat also if you're interested. Okay. So we focused actually on the most complex sensing problems. This is ionic sensing. Because ions, they often occur in very low concentrations. They fluctuate, so it is very hard to distinguish them from the background noise. So this was a very challenging problem, right? So there is one aspect. There was one partner that I heavily collaborated with. We actually looked at multiple sclerosis diagnostics using this very sweet algorithm. Okay, and we came up with the idea of a barcode principle. So this is one of the holy grails of reservoir computing. If I go one step back, right, is this readout layer. You see, if you look at the equation, it actually grabs the time instantaneous value of the system state. This is not a filter, right? This is not a filter. But you know what we allowed a little bit. We allowed the readout layer to see a little bit of the past. So it's like a barcode, right? When you go to supermarket, you want to buy something, so there are these barcodes on the things. Yes. So basically, the output that you get from the system serves as a barcode. So if you can get distinct outputs for different environmental conditions, but maybe then you can look a little bit in the past and gain additional information and at a very modest engineering cost. Okay. So that worked like a charm. Okay, so we tried just as an idea of healing spinal cord injuries. And there, the human-machine interaction is of essence. Okay, so we tried several problems that deal with computing with natural resources. So if you look at the world around you, so everything is a possible computer, right? Plants, insects, ants, yeah. Even internet and mobile phones. Okay, so you could. So we toyed with the idea. Actually, what we applied this idea, we also applied it to cryptography. Okay, when what you can do, right? Instead of what you can do, you can change the system to be something amorphous, something random, and then actually you can use it for encryption. And then, you know, during this conference, what I realized, there are actually options of actually implementing these algorithms in the context of human-robot interaction. So I don't know if there are any colleagues here in the audience that I invited to see my talk. Maybe we can continue discussing afterwards. Okay. But that I think is a fascinating possibility. So 10 more minutes, yes? And I'm half of my talk. Good. So the plan is working. So how does the algorithm work in the end? Okay, so you know Einstein said that if you can't explain science to 7-year-old, then it's not worth doing. Okay, so I don't want to sound patronizing, but this is my way of actually explaining the algorithm. So imagine that you want to infer what the weather is like while you're sitting in a room without windows. Okay, so your only source of information is actually a person who enters the room. So that is our system, yes? And the weather is the environment. But you know, we are not allowed to ask direct questions because I cannot ask a sensor or any dynamical system what I would like to know. So I have to struggle to get information, right? So by assumption, say that we are not allowed to ask the person what is the weather like. But we have to do it through dialogue, asking indirect questions. Okay. So one example would be, you know, I could ask, did you bring your umbrella with you today? So if the person has an umbrella, I might have indication, okay, there might be raining outside. And then the next follow-up question might be, okay, is your umbrella wet? You see, I'm never asking about the weather, but actually I'm collecting information about the weather. And if the person says, yes, it's wet, it means it's raining, okay? If the person comes in, has an umbrella, it's probably cloudy. It's not raining, yeah? So this is the idea. So essentially we are asking small questions. We are providing the system with small questions and then collecting answers. An idea is that we can actually try to amplify trends that are hidden doing in this way. It actually works. The idea works like a charm. So now finally, I think I can explain to you what the title of the talk is, yes? So embedded sensing applications, I think that should be clear. Intelligent sensing substrate, that should be clear. Memory store networks. Okay, so this is what the conference paper is about. So now, if you imagine that this very generic dynamical system, we basically put inside a memory store network and try to achieve all these goals I actually explained before. And then what we try to do, because it's a network, right? So we try to use collaborative interaction between the elements. So I would like to say a few words about that. So what does it mean that you have collaboration, right? So if this is your environment and these are your sensors, right? So the idea is if these sensors interact, then the sensing capacity of this system should be larger than the sensing capacity of the system when they do not interact. You should be able to learn more about the system, right? So it's essentially what I'm saying, that there is a way actually of achieving with 1 + 1 larger than 2, yeah? If they interact. Because this interaction, this is what provides extra information, right? This is what is important. So in contrast, if I have just a series of sensors, exactly the same sensor, right? I'm just duplicating it, and I just do the analysis. So, you know, a question, let me test you very, 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 very fast. Maybe if you think about it for 5 seconds, would you choose A or B as the outcome of this thought experiment? So with no interaction, B is the correct answer, right? You cannot learn anything new, right? So that's the idea. In brief, so a memory store network, here you see it. So the element is a memory store. So memory store is essentially a 2-point device. This is the symbol we use to denote it. So it responds to voltage. It's like a normal resistance, but its resistance changes in time depending on the voltage that you use to drive it. And there are few parameters actually that describe how it works. Okay, so this is the very simple model that we actually investigated. It's called Pershing-de-Ventre model. It basically describes many experimental realizations of a memory store. Okay, and then how do we model environment in this, right? So we model it by changing this parameter that defines the slope of a resistance change. Okay, so this is the environment model. I'm not going to spend time on it. So what happens is that this is the setup. This is the computer, okay? This is the computer we are looking at. So environment actually affects how these resistances change. And then we drive it by external signals, maybe several or one of them, right? Some of the nodes are actually grounded. So these are internal states. These are internal nodes. So that's the computer. Okay. And so now I would like to tell you a very important thing, and that is the purpose of the drive. So why do we need the drive? So basically what happens with the drive is the drive increases the intelligence of a system in a very, very clever way. So it achieves actually phase separation. So if you imagine the trajectory of the system under the influence of two environmental conditions, Q1 and Q2, right? If these trajectories are intermixed, you cannot distinguish them. You don't know anything about in which state the system is. But you know, if I have a trajectory here, if I'm under environmental condition Q1, and here, if I'm under environmental condition Q2, right? Then I know that in what is the state of the environment. So that's the idea of the drive. So you can think of a drive as a prompter in a theater, right? That asks small clues, gives small clues to the actors to help them actually figure out the line they should say. Okay. So we have used this memristor setup, right? Sweet algorithm with the memristor setup we have used to several problems. I would just like to highlight two of them. So one was them sepsis prediction, and then ECG signal classification. Here, it is remarkable with a single memristor and a cleverly chosen drive, we could actually achieve accuracy of a deep neural network. That is crazy, okay? Just shows you how important this drive is. 5 more minutes. I'm about right on time, I think. Okay, before I go on, do you have any questions that are bothering you at the moment? Okay, so let me go on. So what we tried to investigate several network topologies to see what are these features that I talked about that one can actually try to engineer and harvest. So the simplest thing was actually to take the same memristor without changing its characteristics and just make them more complicated networks with it. So this is this direction, okay? The second option was adding feedback elements into the network, making it a little bit more complicated, okay? So element feedback is actually element with a memory. I'm going to explain how it works. And then there's of course combination of these two extreme ways, and this is this direction free. Okay. So these are the networks we considered. So every memristor here is the same, right? So they are homogeneous. So the network is homogeneous. It is not heterogeneous in any way. Here is the example of a network that has engineered feedback added to it. So what do you do? Well, normally you apply voltage to this memristor, for example, but now when you apply the voltage, you combine it with by picking some information about the other part of the network. Okay, so you remember the state of memristance, and then you send it back into the system a little bit later with certain delay time, tau. Okay, and we know from reservoir computing that these delayed feedbacks they help actually increase the intelligence of the system. So this is why we tested it. And these are other types of networks. Now we just combine series and parallel connections. Okay, now I'm slowly entering into this part where I do not expect everybody to follow. Okay, so I apologize if this is the case. Because normally if you have a resistor network, what happens is that voltage distributes, right? So the voltage differences get smaller and smaller if you increase the network size. So we wanted to create actually networks where each memristor actually experiences different voltage differences. So they can measure something else about the environment, okay? So we measured actually that we found a way to quantify the quality of a reservoir without ever bothering about what is that we want to compute. So this is very important direction in the reservoir computing research, where many papers have been written about how to measure the quality of a reservoir. Okay, so we made our own contribution. So this is very, very restrictive a measure of a reservoir quality. Okay. So just to tell you, so we basically simulated many systems. So we computed this number in a very complicated way. I don't have time to explain. And basically, it turns out if you have if this number is very, very large, you have a good reservoir, okay? So this is all you need to know. And so we trained the system. So this is a stable environment, 10 signals only. And then this is varying environment, 10 signals only. So we want to distinguish this from that, okay? And this is the result. Okay, this shows you the importance of the drive. Okay, So if you do not optimize the drive, you see your performance is somewhere here, you know, does not improve that much. If you just do random search, so you choose these drive signals at random, you improve a little, right? You can actually improve, but not that much. So here we had to use really genetic algorithms to find best performance, right? So drive is important. It makes a difference. And here is the first important result, okay? So basically tells you that if you are using homogeneous networks, you are not increasing intelligence of your system. So intelligence likes variety. Yeah, we know that. Linear systems are extremely stupid, right? There is no linear system in nature that actually processes information, right? In chemistry, if you look at the living cell, that has been discussed in previous talks. So what is the non-linear element? Well, it's the presence of enzyme, right? And gene regulation, if you look at the gene regulation, this one molecule affecting the other. It does it in almost binary way. So you have a heavily non-linear system, okay? Now what we done here, we punished the system severely when we tested it. So look at this thing. We only used 20 signals for training, but we used 2,000 signals for testing. And reservoir computing is one of the machine learning paradigms actually that is very beneficial in that sense that you can actually train it on a very few signals. And you can actually get a system that easily generalizes. But you know, it was a surprise to us when we didn't see any improvement. So if I use a very complex network, basically the separability index is exactly the same as for one memristor. So no improvement at all, because all the elements are the same. Everybody sees the same thing, right? So if I go back, what you have, de facto, you have this situation, okay? I'll show you what I mean. This is the situation you have. You basically have a copies of one and the same thing, though you have a very large network. So the whole thing doesn't get more intelligent, okay? And so next network was the one, if you recall, this was the one with feedbacks. So what we did, we changed this delay time in different memristors so they would remember different time scales. And that was extremely beneficial. So you see that actually this intelligence of the system increases as you actually consider more complicated networks. But you know, there is a plateau, right? It doesn't continue. And that's a surprise. That was a surprise that actually, we thought that this graph should go on and on and on, but it doesn't, right? So it stops. This is interesting question, why? We have some answers why it might be, but it's going to be too technical, okay? And this is roadmap in direction 3. Well, it's hard to say, but of course, during the training, it works very well. It improves, but the testing is more tricky, okay? Though it improves slightly, okay? You can see actually there is a weak trend. So there are other things one might try to optimize with the system to actually increase, to make this curve steeper, but that's a separate problem, okay? And here I come to the conclusions. Now I'm 2 minutes behind the schedule. Apologize for that. So in conclusion, I would like to actually now focus on the paper that has been submitted to the conference. Okay, on the conference paper. So this is the scope of the conclusions. So we found a way of defining a separability index without considering a specific readout layer. So this is achievement. Okay. Because you do not have to worry about what the system is going to compute. You can actually assess how intelligent it is, okay? So the separability index has been constructed to detect the genuine collaboration between elements. This is achievement, okay? It is not easy. So we actually made very, very careful tests. What if we just double the sensor and it's actually the same object? It should not get more intelligence. So you have to define it in a very, very careful way, okay? And now, most importantly, so we were able to identify the architectural features of memristor networks that guarantee good sensing quality. You know, sensing is a synonym with information processing with computing, okay? So this input Q can be anything, okay? So the first important thing is that the presence of feedback loops and increased degree of network heterogeneity are beneficial. So you want you want variety in your system, then it works very well. So the presence of feedback loops leads to faster responses and more precise decision boundaries. So you see, this thing this mantra of reservoir computing, the delayed feedback is going to increase your intelligence. Yeah, but to a certain point, okay? It just makes the decision boundaries sharper, okay? So adding identical elements does not improve the sensing capacity. So basically, such elements tend to interact in the same way with the environment without providing additional clues about it. And this is what I told you about homogeneous systems. They are not intelligent. So if heterogeneous elements are linked into a network, each element can recognize a different environmental feature. So that is very important. And here I would like to stop. And of course, you have to acknowledge the money. So a lot of work has been done in the context of this European project. So I would like to acknowledge the support from European Union. And hereby I end the talk. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Zoran, for your thoughtful paper. Very technical, but I think very, very interesting and useful also. Are there questions for Zoran?
So, I am Gianfranco. Congratulations for your interesting speech. Effectively, if I understood well, Memoristor acts like for emphasizing the differences in the signal. So that if you make recursive this, and then you multiply this this filter practically, you obtain a very good separability among your data, your input data. Is right?
Exactly. So you are completely right. This is exactly what the point is. And
Because
actually,
the problem is always the XOR, okay? To solve the XOR, that is the disjoints. And so in this way, effectively, you can separate very deeply in this different content. Yes.
So what we showed, for example, Memristor is interesting because it has a very simple configuration space. It's just variable, right? It's one-dimensional. So it's because the resistance of a memristor is limited between minimum and maximum resistance value. And this has to do with the way that ions diffuse into the material. That's what changes resistance. So basically what we showed already, if you have a one memristor, single memristor, that this extremely almost trivial configuration space, that you can actually use it to distinguish stable from varying environment.
Yes, yes. But it's possible also to distinguish the different frequencies, for instance, because I saw in your scheme different frequencies, the same output. No, but there is also the possibility of distinguishing the different frequencies. Not only variability with respect to stability, but also different frequencies.
Yes. That is true. There is actually a line of research where people focus on that. Correct.
Because tomorrow we present another type of approach to your same problem, but always implementing dynamic system, but it's okay.
And of course, because you could argue that the memristor is boring because resistance per se is a passive element, right? Well, it's easy. There's nothing happening. There is nothing spectacular going on there. It's just a linear relationship. It's Ohm's law. It's a linear relationship between the current through and the voltage you apply. What is fascinating when computing actually happens is when you drive these memristance values to the edges. Because the fact that you cannot cross a boundary, that's your nonlinearity. And that is you want to operate your memristances close to these edges, and then that gives you actually intelligence.
Yes, it's right.
Right. So again, basically confirms the mantra that for intelligence, you need nonlinearity. That we've seen in the simulations, right? That we've seen clearly.
No, it's like with the famous sigmoid function Okay, you have all, yes, all the other correlations, but all depends on the slope of this sigmoid, because which type of correlations you are able to detect depends on the slope. And so if you put as a threshold, the problem is the slope that you choose. Tomorrow we present another approach in which this slope is dynamically defined by the same dynamical process. And so
interesting. So basically what you're telling me is that your Q, this parameter is basically is changed depending on what the device has experienced so far. So in a way, environment is changed by the device. Yes. And this is exactly why I included this transparency from Gordon, right?
Yes,
it was here. Yes.
Yes,
we actually considered the idea, but it thought it was too complicated to actually reason around.
yes,
so we were afraid of it.
yes, No, because in the past we experimented a very effective neural nets in which we put the dynamics on the threshold, not on the weights.
Yeah.
In this way, you have a separation very, because it's like if you move your EV side, you move in this way, so that you distinguish immediately.
So now that you mention it, so basically let me just for the others. So basically there are two ways, right? So you can change the slope and you can change the threshold voltage. So device, So memory store is basically inert. So this alpha is much smaller than beta. So basically this is almost a straight line here. I just exaggerated so that you see. But memory store, resistance doesn't change if your voltage is with this small range. So it needs a certain voltage to wake up. Okay, so basically you can alter. This was another model we considered actually to make this environment sensitive. But then we thought maybe that this is a stronger influence, okay? And there were some arguments why physically, this might be a better model than the threshold.
Yes, of course. If you know exactly what you want to distinguish, for instance, in a logging on a given target, if you work directly on the threshold, it works very well. Of course, for instance, for distinguishing a noisy environment, and then you know exactly what you have to detect. If you work directly on the threshold, it works very well. It's much better than instead of making the learning on the weights and so blah blah, and so the gradient descent with all the problems. No, you know exactly what you are searching for. And then working on the thresholds and then dynamic threshold, you can identify immediately what you are searching.
But Gianfranco, do you know I know about synapses, right? They evolve and therefore the weights change if you just look at the model of a single neuron, right? But I believe that also threshold voltages, they are changing, right? As we are learning.
Indeed, because generally in neural networks, standard connection is neural network. We have a dynamics on the weights, but effectively in the real brain, the threshold is changing, not only the weights. This changes completely the topology of the net in some way. Okay.
So for the others who are listening, so basically what we are discussing is that for those of you who are not experts, that in some sense, if you look at the memory store, right, it does behave as a neuron. In some sense, yes. It is non-linear, it has this triggery behavior. You have to really tickle it a lot and then it's going to start changing, right?
Okay, because the threshold determines how many inputs you are making your summation, okay? And then this is fundamental, but is exactly what we don't simulate in our standard neural nets. Also because if you put the dynamics on the thresholds, the dynamics becomes immediately chaotic.
Oh yeah, that I can imagine. This is why...
Yes, we measured this.
Because you create a feedback, right? You create a feedback. And in a moment you have recurrence, then you have a problem, potential chaos, yes?
But I repeat, for specific recognition problem, it works very well. Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting.
Can I ask a question, please?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. So you said you quantified the quality of your reservoir in a task-independent way with this new measure.
Yes.
Which is great. It's nice to be able to do that. But you also said that you had to optimize the drive signal. Now, is that a task-dependent optimization or a task-independent?
And here's the thing. Thank you for asking that, Susan. So the thing is, you only do it once during the training phase. And then, you know, the system is actually supposed to exploit this. You never touch it again. So in a way, during your training phase, you borrow the intelligence to the system by actually trying to find the drive that synchronizes all these interactions in the most optimal way. And this was a remarkable achievement. You know what, this second paper, ECG classification, it is exactly that mechanism that helps us actually achieve the accuracy of a deep neural network. You know, intelligence doesn't come for cheap. Yeah, you have to have physical realization of it. And actually, where does it come from if you just have a single memristor? It's actually in the drive.
Yeah.
Because there's something in the ECG signal, right? There is something in ECG signal that likes to be described in your language. There is some, you know, advantageous representation of that sort of synchronizes there.
So I now don't understand the training phase, because you said you only had to use 20 signals rather than 2,000 in the test.
Right.
But then you said you optimize using a genetic algorithm. So if you've only got 20 signals or 20...
Still on these 20 signals, yes? On these 20 signals.
But do you run those 20 signals multiple times in the genetic algorithm? Or do you only run the 20 signals the once?
Okay, this is the problem. Okay, good question. Thank you. Very good question. So I'm just trying to find the figure with here, okay? So there are two things, right? So these 20 signals, they enter as Q. And then you have to vary U. So which means you do have to repeat your simulation many, many times.
Okay.
So these are 20, but you pay the price, right? Because you have to find the U. But the thing is, once you find the U, then you are set to go.
Great. Okay.
Thank you. And I do apologize if I butchered all these philosophical terms. Okay, I'm really it's not my field. I just drew inspiration from it.
I'm happy with remembering Putnam and so on.
You're probably sick and tired of this computing rock, right? I think it is being discovered in other disciplines.
The rock computes. So, other questions for this brilliant paper? Very useful, I think. Very. Otherwise, we have just 4 minutes break before dinner. Before dinner.
You're the end of the section, because
yes. So in 3 minutes, I hope Dean is with us. Dean Peters. Waiting for Dean, our next speaker. So,
hi, Raffaela, I'm here.
Hi, Dean, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Are you alone or with your co-author, Akim Jung?
You know, unfortunately, it's a great shame, but Akim Jung is not in my spare bedroom with me. That would be very helpful if he was here or logged in to Zoom, but he isn't making it today, so I'll have to do it on my own.
Okay, but it is okay. So
a great disappointment to all of you.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you for the invite. I've enjoyed all the talks so far. I don't know, it's kind of nice actually having such an introduction with the 3 talks. Yeah, they kind of covered similar ground, didn't they?
Okay, so when you are ready, you can share, if you have slides to share, you can do it.
Yeah. Can everyone see that?
Yes, I see.
Yeah, so let me...
Wider.
Right.
Okay, okay.
Okay.
Oh,
So I'm ready to
Sheffield
go.
Hallam University. Okay.
Yeah, and I've moved university. I'm now in Sheffield.
Yes. Okay. I know. Okay.
Yeah. I'm still
For
I
mail
still have
chain.
honorary status at Birmingham, so my emails will get there, but one day they'll turn off my Birmingham email.
I think we can begin 1 minute. No problem. 1 minute.
So let me know when to start, and I'll get fired up.
Okay, you can start the email.
Okay, so there's the contents. I mean, the talk, I chose the name red herring to make a particular point, a particular argument, to try and show that there's something distracting about the way that the Church-Turing thesis is used within cognitive science. So there's the contents. I'm going to talk a little about the origin of the talk, because that'll help explain what the main argument point of the talk is, and where the talk came from. And then I'm going to kind of refine. I don't know, red herring is an English saying, so for any of you not familiar with what a red herring is, I'll explain how the word red herring is used in English. And then I'm going to give, I'm guessing, a very brief introduction to the Church-Turing thesis, but I'd be interested if anyone in the room is unfamiliar with the Church-Turing thesis. I'm presuming, particularly with this crowd, most people will be familiar with it. And then I've got six small subsections on why the Church-Turing thesis may not apply in cognitive science. So I'll go through those examples, and that's the point in the talk where I'll be most wishing that my co-author was sat next to me, giving the technical examples of those. And then there's some diagrams which are in the paper. If you Google me, you'll find the paper already on my University of Birmingham webpage, and that's got the diagrams in. And then I've got some provocative conclusions and future directions. So this talk came about, it's a surprisingly long time ago now. I went to a talk in the School of Computer Science at the University of Birmingham, where Achim Jung and John Barden and Dan Geeker all gave talks on computation and computability and consciousness. And I know that John Barden was in our Zoom meeting earlier. He was listening to one of the previous talks. I don't know if he's in here now. And he gave a talk on on this related area. And it was this kind of very much, what do computer scientists, and in particular theoretical computer scientists, have to say about how computation and consciousness are linked by cognitive scientists? And Achim, a few months before he gave this talk in 2015, had been talking to a professor in cognitive science. And the professor in cognitive science said, oh, well, yeah, but these two computational formalisms we know are equivalent. So we don't need to worry about any differences between them, and kind of we can put them aside and not really engage with any possible differences between these computational formalisms, because Church-Turing thesis tells us that they're computationally equivalent. And Achim, who is a professor of theoretical computer science, went, wait a second, is that quite right? Are they really equivalent? You know, can we use the Church-Turing thesis as a kind of as a way of just pushing things off the table and saying we're not even going to consider them because they're computationally equivalent? And so if you wanted a kind of 1 minute summary of the whole talk, then it's really questioning that idea. And the reason why I've used the idea of red herring is because I think this idea is so prevalent, and it's Akim talks about an 80-year orthodoxy in computer science and cognitive science and artificial intelligence. And it actually stops debate, and it stops people even looking for exceptions. And that's why it's a red herring. So that's really what the talk's about. If you want to go home now or whatever, or go or stop, that's the core of the talk. Then after the 2015 talk, I spoke to Akim and we decided to write the material up. And in 2018, I did an AISB paper in philosophy beyond AI, and I think Juicy Gallo is in the Zoom meeting now, and it was very kindly hosted there. And I presented a paper where I took some of Akim's ideas and tried them out as a way of defeating Searle's Chinese room argument. And people in the room, it was quite favourably received. But one of the criticisms, or not a criticism, one of the limitations was people said, I think you've technically nailed it. Technically, we agree, but I'm not actually quite sure what the impact of all of these deviations from Church-Turing thesis, what they actually amount to, what's their real world impact? How much difference will it make? So technically, you're right. And so I'd be interested in anyone's feedback on this talk, whether you think the arguments I give are knockout blows that kind of that knock out the Church-Turing thesis interpretation, or whether they're rather more technical and you think you need to see more substantial kind of backup for these. And so this then brings us to this current red herring paper. Thank you very much to Raffaela for inviting me. I've actually realised with the first 3 talks, I couldn't be in a better place for getting feedback on this talk. I suspect that the first 3 authors will have ideas about what I'm going to talk about, and so please do chip in with any kind of criticisms or limitations. I think that'd be really valuable. This work is still to be published, and it would be really great to get some kind of criticisms of it. I'll move on to the next slide. So a red herring, I chose the red herring in the title because a red herring is something that misleads or distracts from an important question. And if you look up red herring on Wikipedia, then there's an example. The very first time it was used was someone using a red herring, a very smelly fish, to divert some hounds from a rabbit. And so what I'm suggesting is that the way that the Church-Turing thesis is used diverts people from what could be a prize. There's something that people aren't seeing because they're distracted by this interpretation. But that isn't to say that the Church-Turing thesis, as it's used by mathematicians, is incorrect. We're not saying that the Church-Turing thesis is incorrect. We're suggesting it's entirely correct, but it's misused. And it's this misuse which is a red herring. Other people have made similar kind of comments here. My PhD student, my PhD supervisor rather, was Aaron Sloman, and he has a paper that's available on the web about the irrelevance of Turing machines to AI, where he talks about how AI is to do about control systems and issues around representation, and Turing machines are irrelevant to that. And we're going a step further in this paper and saying not only are Turing machines and the Church-Turing thesis irrelevant to cognitive science, we're actually saying that it's actively misleading, and it's unfortunately stopping debate that otherwise would happen because people kind of erroneously say that Church-Turing thesis says that different computational formalisms are equivalent, whereas actually it's a more subtle message that the Church-Turing thesis has said, that they produce the same set of functions, not that they're equivalent in every way. There are aspects of computation aren't covered by Church-Turing thesis. And so here's another little takeaway point at the bottom of this slide. Turing machines provide something, and then the way that the Church-Turing thesis is used takes it away. So if you look at the work of Hilary Putnam and the way that he used Turing machines in the 60s, it is this wonderful revolution, which is kind of in the written version of my paper is documented by Zenon Pilishin and people like Andy Clark, where this idea of multiple realizability coming from Alan Turing's 1936 paper was wonderfully revolutionary. This idea of multiple realizability was a real kind of revolution in the field. But what we're claiming in this paper is people took that very positive idea from Turing machines and then overextended it by saying that everything is equivalent to a Turing machine. And we're saying, well, they might be equivalent in the set of functions that they can produce when they've got finite input and finite output and all these other kind of assumptions and constraints that come with the Church-Turing thesis, but they're not computationally equivalent in the broader sense. And there are 6 examples that I give later in the talk where they're not, we claim that there are certain kinds of modern computation. And if we think about just referring back to the 3 talks that went before me, I hope you don't mind me characterizing some of what you were talking about as kind of exotic. What I'm claiming in this paper is that there's nothing exotic about the kinds of mechanisms I'm coming up with. What I'm suggesting is that software engineers and people who are working right now with different kinds of programming languages are using things and using computation and using techniques that are strictly beyond Church-Turing thesis. So I'm not talking about beyond Church-Turing thesis in bacteria or in quantum computing. I'm talking about Church-Turing thesis in everyday modern computing, because one of the other punchlines of this talk is that Church-Turing thesis applies very well to 1950s computing, where there were batch jobs and you got all your bits of card and you put them in a machine the size of a house and it churned away and it printed out these bits of card afterwards. That is entirely covered by Church-Turing. But one of the punchlines we could say here is, if you took all of the computing that was going on today in terms of computers that were connected to the internet and all the different processes and all the different things that those computers are doing, are we really saying that what that is kind of equivalent to what a Turing machine could do, and you can actually get a Turing machine to do all of that stuff? And we're suggesting no. If you've got the many millions of computers around the world and all the different kinds of parallel computation and any real number computation they're doing and all these different kinds of processes, that actually, even if you've got a super fast Turing machine and optimized in lots of different ways, they're not equivalent. Okay, any questions at this point? Or I'll move on. So I'm guessing people are probably quite familiar with Turing machines and Church-Turing thesis. So if I was in a different symposium room, I might take longer to go over this. So please do put your hands up and ask questions if I'm giving it too cursory a coverage here. So one of the messages that we're making in this paper, one of the arguments, is you can see what the constraints of the Church-Turing thesis is. You can look at the bounds of the Church-Turing thesis when you look back historically at the question it was trying to solve. And several of you in your talks this morning have talked about this distinction between a kind of mathematical analysis and a kind of concrete computation analysis. And obviously the Church-Turing thesis came from the work of Alan Turing and Alonzo Church trying to solve a mathematical problem with Diophantine equations, where these were kind of obviously integer numbers, a finite number of operations with rational integers, and asking whether there's a rational procedure given a set of axioms. So it was a mathematical question, and both of them developed their computational formalisms to answer this question. And so we can see the limitations, the bounds of the Church-Turing thesis come from the mathematical question that was being solved by Alonzo Church and Alan Turing. So Alan Turing in particular came up with what we now call a Turing machine. And in his paper in 1936, he set out this kind of computational device, and you know, gave rise to modern computers. But what he was actually doing was, you know, solving you know, Hilbert's 10 problem that was developed into the decision problem. And within that paper, he came up with the idea of universal computation and the fact that a Turing machine could compute every possible function. And so we agree with that. We agree with the Church-Turing thesis that Alonzo Church and these other researchers and Emil Post with his production systems, we agree that the Church-Turing thesis is correct, that all of these formalisms do calculate these same set of computations, but we're just reminding everyone that those computations were finite input, finite output, no representation of time, and these other assumptions, you know, not real numbers, no parallel processing, and so the Church-Turing thesis came from the idea that not just Gödel's recursive functions and Alonzo Church's lambda calculus, but also post-production rules and many other formalisms all define the same class of computable functions from the numbers to the numbers. So it's finite number input to finite number output. So we're not disproving the Church-Turing thesis here. We entirely agree with it that if something is incomputable, then it can be computed by a Turing machine. And if a Turing machine cannot compute it, then it's not computable by any other mechanism whatsoever. What we're really saying is that there are higher order and more subtle kinds of computation that can be carried out by things that are more complicated than Turing machines. So those things can still produce the same set of computations as Turing machines. So something more complicated than a Turing machine can still do everything that a Turing machine can do. And the kinds of extra stuff it can do isn't creating extra functions or extra computable numbers. So the scope of the Church-Turing thesis, this is where, you know, the bounds of the Church-Turing thesis is, it calculates functions, but there have to be finitely many inputs, not infinite number of inputs, not inputs that are themselves infinite. So it's finite data types, and you can kind of encode strings as numbers, so there's some flexibility there, and it can have functions acting on the code of other functions. So one of the consequences of this is that it's actually rather simple to show that a language is Turing complete. And in the paper, in the written version of the paper, you know, it points to some really very, very simple formalisms. And that's where the problem comes in. The fact that if there's something that's got unlimited memory, which might be by pointer structures, some branching and some while loops, that you can actually produce every kind of computation, that's leads, when it's misinterpreted, a kind of extreme kind of reductionism. What we're suggesting by saying that all formalisms are equivalent, then people say, oh, well, consciousness can't be computational because Turing machines clearly can't be conscious, therefore nothing else that's computational can be conscious. We say, well, that's an erroneous kind of overextension of Church-Turing thesis, because computational systems can have greater subtlety and sophistication and greater expressivity and power than Turing machines. And so they're still within the Church-Turing thesis when they're dealing with finite inputs and finite outputs. But when they're doing other things, they can do stuff that might be interesting to you know, ideas around consciousness. So that's the claim there. Looking at this, this is the slide that's setting out what we're going to be spending the next kind of 10 minutes looking at. We're going to be going through example by example of where Achim and Jung and I claim that there are kinds of contemporary computation, things that are happening today that are beyond Church-Turing thesis, and lots of these are from a kind of theoretical computer scientist's perspective. And so what I've done here is kind of group them together. So the first kind of issue with the Church-Turing thesis is these computational formalisms like the lambda calculus or Turing machines strictly exist outside of time. Yeah. So you don't have time, you don't have a clock. There isn't a clock. There's no clock in the Turing machine, and you know, lambda calculus is even more abstract and removed from any kind of physical clock. Whereas consciousness is kind of existing in time. There's lots of people, I mean, I heard Susan earlier saying that she had nothing to say about consciousness. But, you know, consciousness clearly is being in the here and now. And so time, if you want to explain consciousness, you want to have something to do with time. And so saying that all formalisms are equivalent is problematic, because you're saying that formalisms that deal with time and formalisms that don't deal with time are equivalent when we care about time for things like consciousness and attention and things. Zdeněk Pilishin in particular wrote a lot about computational complexity, which I'm not going to be talking any further about, but we are recognizing, you know, that people have kind of theoreticians have pointed out that there's different computational complexity for Turing machines and cognitive architectures. But that isn't, you know, that isn't so widely held. But there are other issues like are people suggesting, you know, any function call from a Turing machine has a start and an end. It has input going in and there's an output coming out. So are we saying that a forever process, not just an operating system, but a human, you know, there are certain elements of our cognition that start when we're born and end when we die, the models that we build up, are we saying that they're strictly kind of functions that, you know, do we have functions that are running for 90 years that we can analyze in terms of the Church-Turing thesis? And, you know, modern cognitive science is moving away from this idea that we've got sense data going in and then outputs coming out with predictive processing and these kind of ways of thinking of cognitive science, where we, you know, the sense data is only really moderating this internal model in these predictive processing. So that's an issue around time. I'm going to talk a bit more about real-time computation in a slide in a second. And there's input after the computation starts. And Alan Turing explicitly ruled this out of his analysis. In the 1936 paper, he talks about choice machines and they're interactive machines, and he explicitly says, well, they're something different. They're not covered in my analysis. So why would we say that any kind of interactive processing is within Church-Turing when Alan Turing himself kind of rules it out? And how much modern computing is not interactive? You know, so there's a huge amount of computing going on that we might strictly reasonably say is outside of Church-Turing. Though, of course, if we can find a bit of computer time where there's no interaction, then that would be within Church-Turing. But, you know, the message here is that things are much more complicated. And there's other issues around computation with infinite streams and infinite inputs. And, you know, you could have a computational formalism that was prepared to cope with kind of infinite precision and constantly asking for more precision from the function call. And higher order computation I'm going to talk about in a moment as well, this idea of having real numbers and functions of functions. And it's a whole load of issues around self-reference and an architectural view. So multiple processing, intentional computation and parallel computation. And this is pushing us more towards the idea of self-referential systems and systems with multiple loci of control. And lastly, I don't think there's a slide on probabilistic computation, but, you know, the fact that people can break computer security because of bugs in computer secure systems because they haven't got true random number generators, and Turing machines don't have random number generators. We're clearly, you know, there's a mismatch there between contemporary computing and the kind of 80-year-old kind of analysis of Alan Turing and Alonzo Church and the Church-Turing thesis. Any questions or comments at that point?
Could I just put in a bid, please, for people not to say infinite when they mean unbounded?
Okay.
Because they are different.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, what means intentional computation?
I'm just about to explain that, so we'll get to that in a second.
Ah, yes, okay.
So one of the key issues here is we're not talking about hypercomputation. So there's lots of people periodically say, the Church-Turing thesis is wrong because we can actually come up with formalisms that break the rule that there's everything that can be computed by a Turing machine is computable, and anything that it can't is not computable, and so that you can kind of get things that can compute uncomputable numbers. We're not saying that, yeah? Although there are people that claim that, and there is one slide where I talk about real number computation where the paper actually makes that claim. We're not making that claim, yeah? We're not making any kinds of claim about hypercomputation. And so I've quoted here, the words I've got are taken from the paper, which is, it's possible to use a rich interactive machine to implement simple functions. Yeah, you can add 2 and 2 to make 4 using the most complicated computer in the world. And when it does that function, when it adds 2 and 2 to make 4, it's clearly within the Church-Turing thesis. It's the other stuff rather than these function calls. So it doesn't lead to new computer functions. The Church-Turing thesis is valid even if more sophisticated machinery is employed. And so it's the other direction that's the point that we're making in this paper. It's when the tasks are more complicated, then Turing machines can't do them. Yeah, but what we're saying is there are more complicated tasks than Turing machines can do. Okay, so the first point to make is some quotes here by Galtieri Piccinini, where, and I think actually I'm a little bit humbled to be with the 3 previous speakers who clearly are great experts in physical computation. And so Piccinini is just really making some of the points that you guys already made in your first 3 talks. There's a somewhat unclear relationship between mathematical computation and concrete computation or physical computation. And that was the basis, I guess, of some of your talks, was elucidating what these links between the mathematical concept and the physical concept. And what I'm really showing, or what Achim Jung and I's ideas over the next few slides, is adding some flesh to this issue about not relying on the maths that's within Church-Turing to come up with ideas and espouse a kind of philosophy of cognitive science that's overly informed by this kind of mathematical view of computation. And we're really saying you don't have to talk about all the exotic things that the 3 previous talks talked about, just everyday computing. Some of it is beyond, some of the things in everyday computing are beyond Church-Turing. And so as a cognitive scientist, you know, Achim Jung is the theoretical computer scientist. I'm the, you know, I work as my day job is as a psychologist. The reason why we've come together is to say theoretical computer science can weed out this red herring, can remove this red herring from interpretation by people like me who otherwise wouldn't know any better. The real-time computation, I've already talked about this. Turing machines have no clock. And Zenon Pilishin kind of made this distinction in the late 70s and the 80s, and in his kind of famous 1986 book, that you know, we can't expect kind of modern contemporary cognitive models to have the same computational complexity as Turing machines, but he did talk about, you know, emulating a functional architecture, and then the computable functions and the not computable functions would be equivalent. So we're making a further point here that there are things that cognitive architectures can do, not creating kind of new computable functions, but other things that they can do that we would care about. So for example, consciousness we can view as some kind of synchronization in time. There's obviously a lot more to consciousness than synchronization in time, but you know, the binding of things in time, and you know, the taste of the apple and the look of the apple and the crunch and the sound of the apple all occurring, and we've got this conscious experience of this apple is part of the story. And so we're really posing the question, you know, does a real-time clock in concrete computation mean that computers are more powerful than Turing machines, because Turing machines don't have that clock? This isn't like some abstract philosophical argument, because the clock use is ubiquitous in modern computers. You can't even open any of your files with double clicking without using the real-time clock. Yeah, that's the first of 6 slides that we're claiming that modern computing, and therefore the kind of computation that we would invoke in cognitive science, are outside of Church-Turing thesis for this reason on its own. Then this, I haven't got a lot to say on this. Susan's, I can see Susan is one of the 3 heads I can see in my view here, and she's nodding her head here, so perhaps in the questions she can explain why. But I've just put this in because I've just read the Piccinini book, and he talks about Siegelman's claims in that book about things may be more powerful than Turing, but this isn't the claim that we're making. This is the one claim in the talk that is actually claiming some kind of hypercomputation. And so it's a bit more provocative, and maybe I shouldn't have put it in, but just for the sake of completeness, that this is the kind of claims that people are making. We're not making hypercomputational claims. Maybe Susan can speak to this in the questions section at the end of the talk. And we've got 3 researchers that have all talked about processes. And I think this process view of computation is really interesting, and is one of the things that I think is, in my personal view, one of the really powerful reasons why cognitive scientists shouldn't invoke Church-Turing thesis, because so much of, you know, and I'm still drafting the paper that this will eventually be submitted to the journal, and I'm going through lots of cognitive scientist theorists talking about how, oh, we shouldn't talk about states, we should talk about processes, you know, and this process view of cognition and this process view of psychology is really, really important. And what Milner and Hoare, both in the mid-80s, came up with was these formalisms for talking about communicating systems. And here I've just screen grabbed a nice little paragraph from Milner, where the idea of the calculus is to come up with the formalism that's very flexible and expressive, and allows you to reason mathematically about systems within the calculus, but nowhere there does it mention the kind of computation or the computational formalism. So these kind of process calculi, in some sense, are, you know, people may disagree. My claim is that they're kind of orthogonal to issues around computation. And one of the reasons we can think that is the Philippou reference, the citation at the bottom of this screen, actually has nothing to do with computation at all. It's a development of Hoare's process calculus that's used for modeling ecological systems, and the processes that are going on are reproduction and predation and things like this. And you can kind of prove outcomes in a kind of ecological model, nothing to do with computation. So you can say things about computational systems using process calculuses that describe those systems. And there's a rather nice example in Hoare's 1985 book about dining philosophers. And you can see the analogy here that instead of being computational systems, there are these philosophers that are either in their room or in the dining hall. And rather bizarrely, they're all given one fork each, but they need two forks to put their spaghetti out. And so what the people have come up with this example is something that can cause a deadlock because they have to borrow each other's forks. And so it's a kind of metaphorical thing or an analogous to a deadlock situation. And as Hoare shows, you know, you can have deadlock unless you have a footman, and the footman doesn't let people out their rooms until there's a spare fork for them to dish their food up. And so that's kind of mathematically proved, and nothing to do with computation, but it could be a kind of computational system. And particularly, you know, these thoughts that we've had about issues, psychological issues, cognitive science issues about synchronization and consciousness and times when all of the resources can be accessible at the same time. So we can say something about a kind of computational approach to consciousness, but we've got a more expressive formalism here than Turing machines. Turing machines aren't going to tell us anything about separate processes being deadlocked because it's a serial system. It's not got parallel parts to it. It can only simulate those. And it can go further. The two books that kind of that launched process calculi were in the 80s, where Samuel Abramsky from Oxford, in his recent 2017 paper here, kind of makes points that are very helpful to our argument. He says that actually loads of computation that's going on isn't actually about function computation, it's actually about management of processes. And actually coming up with some kind of Church-Turing for processes is more difficult than for functions. And so he contrasts computability theory, where we've got a definite calculus and we've got the Church-Turing thesis, and then processes, there's no established mathematical theory, there's no plausible Church-Turing thesis for processes. But this is processes, you know, computational processes that he's talking about. And in that 2017 paper, he sets out a kind of roadmap for future research. So it's a live question. He's a theoretical computer scientist, and I guess most people who listen and read his work are theoretical computer scientists. And that's where the red herring comes from. It's not that there aren't people making these points, it's that they're not, these ideas aren't getting into cognitive science, where people are going, oh yeah, no, process calculi would be a really useful thing to be thinking about these kinds of cognitive science processes. We don't just have to think about function calls. And at a previous conference in Warwick, we had the International Conference on Cognitive Modelling, and some of the very computationally literate cognitive scientists there were really opposed to the ideas in this talk. They were saying, oh, well, no, you know, computation and cognition is kind of function calls. And so hopefully over the last several years, we've kind of made a stronger case really to persuade people of this. And then this Gold, Iden, Wegner paper was really nicely pointed out to me by the reviewer of this work in 2018. So thank you very much. And it's extremely helpful paper because we build on this kind of process calculi approach, because what we're claiming is that processes are outside of the Church-Turing thesis, but the way that you would have kind of process calculi informed by Hoare and Milner's work is it wouldn't mesh in with the actual computation. So the function call would still occur outside of the process. So in terms of like our dining philosophers, you know, they would, it's talking about whether those, the machinery is deadlocked from getting hold of the fork or whatever, or the analog of the fork was, but then the function would still get called without interruption. And what Goldin and Wegner point out in their 2005 paper is that there's this myth, they call it the strong Church-Turing interpretation, that the Church-Turing apply means that all computational formalisms are equivalent, and they make the point that Turing machines are distinct from choice machines that Turing makes, and they bring in the concurrency, they bring in the parallelization, they bring in the interruptions actually within the actual computation. So where Hoare and Milner's approach, you could have parallelization, but then computation still occurring in an isolated way, and then the systems going on to interact with other systems in parallel. What Golden and Wegener have developed is persistent Turing machines, which actually can be interrupted partly through their operation. And we've got a more recent paper detailing the operation of these, which is cited in the paper version of this talk. And that's really in its infancy. So there's different ways that we can talk about interruptions and parallelization. So it's these kind of constant repeated blows here that we're trying to make this point again and again. First of all, we make the point about processes with Hoare and Milner, and then we make it with Wegener, different kinds of parallelization. Somebody asked what intentional computation was. And so now we're on the intentional computation. And this is the idea that intentional computation is where there's some kind of program analysis that occurs in the function call. So there's some kind of sensitivity to the input. And so this is one of Akim's slides here that I've borrowed into my talk. And so in Java, if you put a function with input of 7 and a function with input of 3 plus 4, you get exactly the same outcome, yeah? Because the numbers are added together with no trace or no record of the fact that they were actually different. Whereas in Lisp, because of the quote operator, you can actually keep that information and so keep that there. And so there's a difference there that Lisp can do things that Java can't do. So, you know, the extensional computation, most computation is extensional, where it's the kind of based on the behavior of the function. And in intentional computation has been called a kind of woolly beast. It's a much less known kind of computation, but it's actually interesting for our purposes because it's the very start of self-reflection here. And again, cognitive scientists care about self-reflection. Cognitive scientists would invoke self-reflection in lots of kind of cognitive processes. And so that's a big difference, isn't it? The fact that some formalisms have this intentional computation, which is a little minimal atomic amount of self-reflection, and others don't, we would claim they're clearly not equivalent in something that matters, although the same functions in Lisp and Java would give the same output. So there's no difference in terms of whether it's a computable function or not, or whether it's uncomputable, but there's some aspect of the system keeping track of itself or reflecting on it, doing some kind of program analysis. And Jay in 2019 has been Akim Jung in previous talks I've seen him on this subject said that Jay has really struggled to get his work published. And in his 2019 paper, he refers to the difficulty of getting it published and is pleased that it's been published because lots of people in his research area didn't want to publish his work. He came up with a more expressive calculus than lambda calculus. Oh no, that can't be the case, you know, because of Church Turing. And so I'm pleased for the guy that he finally, you know, after we've been talking about this, we've been talking about it for 6 years, and in 2019 he did get it. His calculus is beyond extensional functions and functional programming. It's queries the internal structure of their arguments. It's a form of program analysis, and I won't read out the quote there, and I'm certainly not qualified to make some judgment about the heavy work done by Gödelization. I don't know if anyone in the room is, but I think the point here for our purposes is this certainly is something to be considered when we're considering this red herring question, isn't it? The fact that you know, although it's a minority view in the field, he's making a very strong claim that you can have more expressive formalisms and they're relevant, you would think, to issues of interest for cognitive scientists. And then I'm going to whistle over this last example here. This is an example from Achim Jung, and there's the function he's talking about is called parallel OR, and he's come up with this function because the best, most easy, obvious way to solve it is with threading or multiple agents. Yeah, and so if we think of this argument, the first argument is true, then the result should be true. If both arguments are false, then the result should be false. But if either argument is present, then the function is allowed to hang. And the fact that it can hang, if either argument is present, though it has to be true if one of them's true, means that if you just put that into something like Pascal or a Turing machine, then it wouldn't work. It couldn't kind of compute that function. It has to have some parallelization. Now, you could argue that a Turing machine or Pascal or some simple language that doesn't have threading can be used to implement threading. And this is where this is a more subtle argument here. We're saying that if you've got to kind of bring in your parallelization by emulating a formalism that has parallelization, it's not the same thing as the system itself having that ability itself, that we're not really saying those formalisms are equivalent. We're saying it's a cop-out to say they're equivalent because one can emulate the other, which I don't know what people think about that argument. And so what we're really trying to do to solve this kind of function, to compute this function, is we don't just want to have one agent, because one agent would get stuck. So we're looking for a network of computational agents. And Achim argues there isn't a Church-Turing for this simulation because what we're really looking to do is get independent computational agents. And so, you know, you could still have that wrapped around with a complete program, but being able to control or react to the other programs is an important issue that's outside of Church-Turing. Oh, sorry. I'm nearly at the end now. After Achim and I, shall I stop for questions before I do this diagram? Any comments or questions at this point before we move on? Okay, so I showed.
I have one. So you're basically saying that in the space, there is a space of computable functions, and then there is a part of functions that are non-computable. So you're basically telling us that there is something in between, right?
No. The diagram explains it. So I'll move on to the diagram.
Okay.
And take your answer. What we're saying is this diagram speaks to your question, really. So what we're saying is Church-Turing only applies to the left-hand side of the diagram, yeah? And what the left-hand side of the diagram has is a dashed line distinguishing computable and non-computable functions, yeah? And there's nothing in the line is very, very thin. There's nothing in between computable and non-computable functions, yeah? Does that answer your question? So, so what we're saying is, within the box on the left-hand side of the diagram, we're talking about classic batch job computation. So a 1950s mainframe where you've got your cards, you put them in, and then you got your cards and you took them out. That's covered on the left-hand side of the diagram. And it's also covered with any modern computer that's doing the kinds of computations that could be done on that kind of old-fashioned computer. So any kind of function call where there's no interruptions and it's finite input, finite output, no parallelization, or then either it'll be a computable or uncomputable function. And what we're saying on the right-hand side of the diagram is that there is no dividing line. So when you've got more complicated kinds of tasks, no one has yet worked out a Church-Turing thesis for processes. And no one's yet worked out a Church-Turing thesis for interruptions. Now, a lot of the time, people think they're doing processes or interruptions, but actually it turns out they might be doing functions that could still be done on a machine on the left-hand side of the diagram. But what we're saying is there will be some cases where people are doing more complicated tasks. They're looking at synchronization, they care about time, they care about real numbers. These things are making a difference to their computation. And at that point, we're saying there's no one size fits all. So what we really care about here isn't coming up with new computable numbers or a difference between a gap between computable and uncomputable numbers. Because that type of computation, we think that's a little bit off with the fairies. Yeah, we're not making these kind of wild claims. What we're really saying is that when people finally do get a Church-Turing thesis for processes or interruptions, it might not be one size fits all. And so the bottom left part of the diagram where I've got these dotted curved lines, this is Akim's work rather than mine, but when you have this distinction between functions and partial functions, if you only consider the left-hand side, just the functions, then you can show by diagonalization that there's an infinite tower of formalisms. Yeah, and we're saying it could be, the big question mark on the right could be a strict division between computable and uncomputable functions. Or what we could be saying is there's this hierarchy of different kinds of formalisms, and that's helpful for cognitive scientists. Because then what we're saying is there could be a formalism that gives a computational account of consciousness, which is different from and has stronger requirements and is more powerful than a Turing machine. And what we're really arguing against is the extreme reductionism.
Siamo quasi al...
Yeah. So I think I've got a couple more slides and then I'm done really. So this here, I had this prepared for the paper, and then this morning, before the talk start, I thought, well, actually, what we're really arguing, this diagram here conflates, because the left-hand side is not real numbers, it's not parallel, it's not interruptions, and there are lots of different dimensions. And on the right-hand side, we're saying it's all of these things that have been loosened or freed up. And so actually, there's lots of different dimensions there. You have to excuse my absolutely rubbish diagram here. The next diagram is my attempt to do a multi-dimensional graph. And what I'm really saying is each of those flaps is a different dimension. So what it should really be is a multi-dimensional hypercube or something. But what we're really saying is you could have real numbers in a formalism, but everything else within Church-Turing, or you could have a real time in a formalism, but not have real numbers and not have intentional computation. But all of these add up together, they all aggregate. So there were 6 different ways that we loosen Church-Turing. You could loosen all 6 at the same time, or loosen one or the other. And so I've redid the diagram this morning as well, which isn't in the paper publication. But what we're really saying is there's this little bit of the landscape of computability, which is within Church-Turing, and then there's the whole rest of the world. So I don't know if anyone here is from Luxembourg, but we're saying Luxembourg is in the middle of Europe. It's the Church-Turing compliant part of the landscape. And there's all these other wonderful places that you can go to. But importantly, they're not as exotic as what the 3 previous speakers were talking about. These are everyday things, yeah? So, the reason why it's a kind of odd idea that Church-Turing computation is just Luxembourg and all these other things are around is because they're all happening in plain sight. Yeah, software engineers can be very good software engineers and use programming languages to do wonderful things without ever having heard of Church-Turing and without being aware that they're violating. So this is actually a message for software engineers who are getting on very well, aren't they, with their software engineering. It's making the point to philosophers who pontificate about limitations. And so here's the limitations claim. So one of the limitations, you know, from this, there was a professor in Liverpool when I first presented this who said, well, technically you're right, but what difference does it make? Was her basic limitation. You know, I agree with you, but, you know, is it going to change the world? And so my response to that kind of limitation is, well, they can act in aggregate, and it is worth thinking about. And something that Achim and I will work on is, what's the real world impact of these things? Are some of them rather technical but won't make a difference? Or are they, you know, the timing one is behind lots of computation, isn't it? What difference does that make? They all act in one direction, so all of them are talking about an increase in expressivity. And the main point we're making here is, don't use maths to make claims in psychology, yeah? And so the paper that we did in 2018 was Searle's Chinese room, and I think this kind of really does demolish Searle's Chinese room, because he's reliant on, for that argument, for saying this very simple kind of computation that he describes in that paper in the 80s applies to all possible computation that could ever exist in the future. So that's a very strong claim and highly reliant on CTT. Anyway, I'd love to know any more limitations, so I'm going to shut up now and let people ask questions and pick its pieces.
Okay, thank you, Dean, for your beautiful talk. Very interesting. Are there questions?
Sorry, about the intentional computation with S, that is the logical counterpart of the intentional with T. There is a possibility of implementing the intentional computation over a theory, the theory of Kripke models, in which we have the possibility that you have practically the duality between coproducts of a coalgebraic structure. Remember that coproducts are effectively disjoint sum, and so define a partition of the in a world of possible states. That is, when you use Kripke models, you have that you can satisfy your function not on only state of the world, but on different alternative states. And by coproduct, you have the possibility of defining the partition on which the dual Boolean algebra is satisfied. It is important, according to me, for going deeply in your speech, to consider the topological computation, that is, starting from the Stone theorem, demonstrating that an ultrafilter of Kloppen sets defined on a topological Stone space is the semantics of the correspondent Boolean algebra. And if you remember that the topological space of Stone theorem are the same topological space of Hilbert subalgebras, you have the possibility of moving from the CTT paradigm to another paradigm in which many of the problems that you stressed so well can be solved. That is, you have to enter in the so-called Stone Age of computability theory, in which you can use the power of the topologies for having a consistent computability paradigm, in which, I repeat, many of the problems is not possible now to address all, but many of the problems that you list that are outside the Church-Turing paradigm can be solved. In other terms, you remember that there is the Oracle Turing machine, no? Is the doctoral thesis of Turing under the direction of Charles at Princeton, in which you have an infinite number of ribbons because you are computing on real numbers. And all the problem is how to jump from when you are faced with the halting problem in the classical Turing machine. If you can jump between these different ribbons, you can solve the halting problem. This jumping is precisely what in a topology is allowed by the notion of homotopy, because the homotopy say that you can have a different path of computation that converge in one only solution. And I think that if you work more deeply on this, you can solve a lot of your problems. I don't know if you know this.
Thanks, Gianfranco. I mean, unfortunately, I think you're talking to the wrong half of the pair of us, really. Achim is the theoretical computer scientist. And yeah, and I don't think we're trying to solve those problems. I think this paper is more about talking about the red herring and saying how church Turing is misused. That's the main message from this paper. And the fact that there are open questions, it would be good if someone solved them, but I don't think we need to solve them to make the point that church Turing is misused. It's incorrectly invoked by cognitive scientists. That's the take home from this this talk.
Because Abramsky worked a lot precisely on this approach, this alternative approach, based on category theory and then on algebra of relations and not on set theory. It is a very powerful alternative. Unfortunately, I don't know why it's very diffused in the UK because Oxford and also in Amsterdam, they work a lot about this paradigm. And effectively, also the notion of you quoted, you quoted before, sorry, on the competitive computation.